Canadian.
That's crazy for a Canadian company. That's crazy. What is the most valuable Canadian company right now? Let me just do a quick check. What is the most valuable Canadian? It's probably Scotiabank or something. It's got to be a bank, right? Because of real estate. Their entire economy is built around propped up real estate prices. The number one Canadian company is, drumroll please, the Royal Bank of Canada, which is on the total list 86, right behind Disney. Damn, Disney had a fall from grace, huh? Disney down here at 155 billion. Yikes. Yikes, dude. 86. We're nearly above Disney. Yes, it is true. Canada's Royal Bank is about to pass Disney. I'll tell you that right here. Disney in the trenches for real? Honestly, for real. Bro, I just saw. I actually put this slide. Well, whatever. You're here. It's late night. Disney is reporting severely softening theme park demand. They said the low-end consumer is tapped the fuck out on going to Disney. Little spoilers. Anyway, back to this. Back to this.
Entire world. 75% of North America's backbone internet traffic travels through his company's networks. An achievement that will earn him the title of Canadian CEO of the Year. This is also John Roth. Or rather, it's a comedian impersonating John Roth. Not particularly well, mind you. There's no genuine attempt at his voice, and the mannerisms are way too high energy. And yet, the audience is eating it up.
Now, final question, Mr. Roth. Where will Nortel be, say, a year from now?
Linda, Nortel is strong. I guarantee investors I will continue to generate profits for them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get back to work. Spare some change?
In this moment, however brief it was, John Roth was maybe the most hated man in Canada. Nortel had been the most widely held stock in the country, and it had just cost them their pensions, militarily annexed by the US. Instead, Canada has spent most of its existence fending off another more indirect form of control: economic subservience. The company that owns the majority of our newspapers is 2/3 owned by an American hedge fund.
Well, that's just
most
good.
of the media we consume is American, and
That's
the
good
basis
too.
of our economy is ripping natural resources out of the ground, shipping them off to America, and then buying them back for twice the price in the form of fancy toys.
I mean, this all sounds like the natural order of things. This is all good. We're spawn camping though. It's just business. Okay? Yeah, but he's not talking about the other side of it. The other side of it is every fucking 2 years, you guys will ship down a celebrity that we all have to worship. And we just fucking pretend they're American. Okay? Every fucking few years. There's a trade-off.
We're America's biggest customer, but they're not ours, and that's a precarious position to be in. Canada's first Prime Minister,
They're not
John A.
sending their
Macdonald,
best.
had just returned
It's
to
the
power.
opposite. Canada is sending their best. Canada is sending their best, bro. We're getting the fucking except for XQC, baby.
Election of 1878. Canada was in the midst of a deep depression that was partially brought on by the Americans canceling a trade agreement in the middle of their Civil War. Macdonald was
Yikes.
keenly aware of the public's distrust of American business, and although behind closed doors he was in favor of free trade with the Americans, he knew they would never sign a new agreement. And so he used anti-American rhetoric to call the rival Liberal Party, quote, veiled traitors, and managed to win both the 1878 and 1891 elections by stoking
That's just good
fears
politics,
of
can't hate
American
it.
annexation. Macdonald's platform was called the National Policy, the centerpiece of which was an aggressive import tax on all American products. The tariff was designed to keep cheap American products out of Canada to promote a strong, homegrown manufacturing industry.
The American hog eating all... The poor little Canadian interest pig can't get a fucking bit of the slop. We're just eating all the fucking slop. Yeah, that's fine, I guess.
The national policy and anti-Americanism dominated Canada's political agenda for decades, and a later attempt at a free trade agreement similarly defeated the government of Wilfrid Laurier in 1911, where it was once again painted as an act of treason. However, the national policy, whose stated goal was to keep Canada British, had arguably backfired. It had only made Canada more reliant on American industry. Take, for example, AT&T. Having secured the Canadian patent for the telephone, their original plan was to simply make telephones in America and ship them up to Canada.
Okay.
The new tariffs made that a complete no-go, so the company hatched a plan. They hired a former Confederate ship captain, sent him off to Canada with a boatload of money, where he proceeded to execute a series of business moves so rapid that in just a few months, he owned almost all telephone lines in the entire country.
Insane.
Alongside this purchase was a single telephone factory in Montreal, a necessary condition to retain the Canadian patent. Parts would be shipped up from the US, assembled in Canada, completely negating the import tax. This was the birth of the Bell Telephone Company of Canada.
Make the whole thing in two easily put together pieces. Have some minimum wage worker in Canada snap it together. This is built in Canada.
And how Canada became a branch plant economy. And as of 1895, that little Montreal branch plant was given a name, Northern Electric and Manufacturing Limited. We've got about a century to go still, but the family resemblance between these two names is clear. Northern made a bunch of stuff. Fire alarms, sleigh bells, gramophones, telegraphs, kettles, toasters, lighters, stoves, washing machines, radios. If it ran on electricity, they could probably make it. But their bread and butter was always telephones. Although legally they were separate entities, AT&T was always in the background, pulling the strings of Bell Canada. With its endless monopoly money, Western Electric was cranking out telephone tech like there was no tomorrow. And Northern Electric got access to technology that no one else did without having to do any R&D. They just took the designs that Western gave them, made their tweaks, and sold them to Canadians. Sometimes the only thing that would change was the logo on the phone. Always the branch plant, never the brains. This symbiotic relationship was just a microcosm of the larger Canadian economy. Even in the 1910s, when AT&T is forced to sell off its foreign holdings due to antitrust reasons, it's allowed to keep its stake in.
Just to expand on that, it's one of the biggest fucking antitrust lawsuits ever, and they busted up AT&T into like 14 companies. They literally split it into 14 separate companies. Can you imagine doing that now? Can you imagine? It's so unfathomable in modern times to think of antitrust enforcing anything like that. It did over the next fucking 4 decades all recombine. Like three of them would merge, then 2 would merge, and then they would all get allowed a little bit, and they all basically fucking recombined. But obviously it was a massive blow, and literally is credited with like a ton of innovation happening in the period when they were broken up. Is it in the video? I'm sorry. If it's in the video, I thought he was just saying. I thought he briefly covered it, so I wanted to give.
In Canada, because the two countries were so interlinked. Canada had spent its first 50 years relying on its Commonwealth parent of Great Britain. But by the 1920s, Canada was now trading more with the US. As productivity began to rise as America modernized its factories, Canada's were quick to follow. Then, out of nowhere, the markets crashed, ushering in the Great Depression across North America. The 1930s saw 80% of Northern's employees laid off. And then it's World War II, yanking the country and the company out of its depression. Northern becomes a dedicated supplier of military equipment for the government. Canada, like the US, emerges from the war in a relatively prosperous position compared to Europe. Northern now had a backlog of nearly 100,000 telephone orders it had to fulfill. Dragged there by the US, Canada had achieved the second highest adoption rate of phones per 100 people in the entire world, going from just 28,000 phones in 1895 to almost 1 million in 1942. And then suddenly, the elephant rolled over. For years, AT&T had been accused of running a vertical monopoly by owning its manufacturer, Western Electric. Desperate to keep its prized possession, AT&T settles out of court and makes a trade on two conditions. The first is to stay out of the computer business. Considering that Bell Labs had just invented the transistor, they were really going to regret this one in about 10 years. The second is more relevant to our story. AT&T now had to offer the same licensing deal for its patents to anyone who asked. But because AT&T owned Bell Canada and was sharing its patents with them for free, that meant that any other US company would be entitled to that same deal. So rather than give away its patents for free, AT&T said, you know what? Canada is on its own. The CEO of Northern at the time described it like this: "We are the child of wealthy parents. This is the boot that kicked us out the door. A Canadian subsidiary of a US company lives a very comfortable life. This is the tragedy of Canada. We've made a virtue of imitation." But he also said this: "I'm confident history will say this is the best thing that ever happened to us."
Okay.
Would you believe me that in a little more than half a century, the mouse would be trying to eat the elephant?
Not crazy.
North, east, south, west, everywhere you go. Northern Electric is the name to know. From coast to coast in Canada.
Canada loves fucking jingles, huh? They always have. This one's kind of a heater, though.
In the 1950s, the Canadian government contracted the company AV Rowe to build a stealth interceptor jet called the Avro Arrow. It was widely considered to be one of, if not the best in its class in the world. Costing around 2.2 billion Canadian dollars in today's money, the Arrow had been the single most expensive R&D project in Canadian history, and it put Canada on the map in the global aerospace industry.
Good shit,
But
Canada.
there was no one to sell it to. The American and the British militaries wanted to produce their own jets. And in fact, America turned around and said, hey, why don't you buy our jets instead? In the most controversial move of his career, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker
That's
fell in
so funny. Yeah, it's like you're Canada. What are you going to do with the jet? And then who's going to buy? Yeah, it's so funny.
line with American defense policy. He canceled the project, ordered all prototypes destroyed, and left 14,000 Canadians unemployed. Although you can argue over the merits of the Avro Arrow itself, the real failure here was that the government refused to support a transition for the facility it had already spent millions on. A facility that could have been converted to civilian aircraft and given Canada its own equivalent to...
That would have been a good idea. It would have been nice if we had a North American competitor to Boeing. Maybe it would cause them to be less fucking sure of themselves that they don't have to fucking do any due diligence on anything, and they can hire the worst fucking CEOs, and we all have to fly Boeing planes even though they fucking suck.
Boeing. It's ironic that Diefenbaker is remembered for capitulating to American influence. Just days before the election that made him prime minister, Diefenbaker had declared that if the Liberals were re-elected, quote, Canada will become a virtual 49th economic state in the American Union. You see, anti-Americanism never truly disappears in Canada, but rather it comes in waves.
I feel
the stretch of time bookended by the two world wars was a notable period of cooperation between the two nations. But now in the era of the Cold War, Canadians were becoming uncomfortable with the idea that they were simply a sidekick to the US. 1956 saw the government release the results of the Gordon Commission, an economic panel which had spent the last year researching the rapid Americanization of Canada. First, there was culture. By the mid-1950s, 80% of magazine sales were from American brands. Canadian newspapers were still Canadian-owned, but any international coverage was usually borrowed from American papers. The Canadian film industry was almost entirely non-existent. Even if we did have films to show, film distribution was owned entirely by Hollywood, and they had no interest in showing Canadian films. Even our education system
that just seems
tended to be
rude.
biased
I'm sure there's some of them that were
America.
good.
There's a particularly infamous textbook on Canadian politics that for some reason had Abraham Lincoln on the cover.
Okay, that's fucked up. That's actually I'd be pissed too. I'd be pissed too. If I was a card-carrying Canadian, I'd be fucking pissed, dude. You put fucking Lincoln on our history textbook? I'd be pissed off. Give me a fucking vat of maple syrup or Wayne Gretzky on the cover. Don't fucking put Lincoln on there.
The real heart of the issue, though, was economic. In 1967, 58% of Canada's manufacturing industry was owned by firms whose headquarters were outside of Canada, and 80% of that fraction was American. And the more specialized you got, the higher the fraction went. Transport, electronics, chemicals, all extremely American. The worst by far was cars. Can you name a single Canadian car brand? You can't, because there are none left.
their proximity to
Natural
Detroit,
resources, which had formed the bedrock of Canada's
that
economy.
doesn't even make sense. And it would be stupid for Canada to try and build a domestic auto industry, being right next to, at the time, one of the world leaders. It would have been inefficient. There would be something else to work on. That wouldn't make sense.
Economy for decades were lining American pocketbooks. Pulp and paper, smelting, mining, and oil and gas, Alberta's pride and joy, was nearly 2/3 owned by Americans. This was such a touchy subject.
Plus, they don't even need cars. They already have moose. True! For real. Why would they fucking... It doesn't even make sense. You know what I'm saying?
There was once a debate in Parliament over whether to allow an American company to build an interprovincial oil pipeline. The debate got so heated, 3 MPs were hospitalized and 1 died of a heart attack. Canada was a branch plant economy, and that was scaring people all across the political spectrum. On the left wing, you had labor organizers who feared that the US would simply set up branch plants in Canada, extract natural resources, and then ship them back down south, where Americans would get to reap the benefits from any newly created manufacturing jobs. On the right wing, the complaints tended to focus
I
on...
would love to see what the percentages are now, because I don't feel like this is still the same setup. Not that Canada is much better off, but rather that America itself has been written out of these equations. And now it goes to China or something. You know what I'm saying? Like we don't have manufacturing. We're not taking raw material to I would assume the middleman is getting cut out. I would love to look more into it.
on how Canada should instead be re-establishing ties with Britain and the monarchy, and that a loss of economic power to the Americans could eventually lead to a loss of political independence. But between these differing sides, there was one common shared concern. American technology was a crutch. Canada had a huge technological deficit. That's one of the key features of a branch plant economy. Branch plants tend to supply jobs that require less training, like resource extraction or assembly lines. Jobs that are easily moved elsewhere if the cost of labor gets too high. Jobs like finance, marketing, and critically R&D are best kept centralized in the home country.
Marketing!
In 1959, if you looked at dollars per capita spent on R&D in the private sector, the US was spending almost 4 times as much as Canada. Here's an even more shocking stat. A government commission in the mid-60s looked at every patent registered in Canada. 95% of them were held by someone outside the country, and 2/3 of that number was in the US. That meant the Canadian industry had to spend millions each year licensing out patents from Americans or costly imports of high-tech equipment. Case in point, Northern Electric. In 1956, the year that AT&T had to divest itself, Northern only made 1% of its revenue from its own design.
I mean, this setup is exactly why, you know, I'm critical of it because it is impossible to compete with fairly, but it's also, this is why China just doesn't give a shit about American patents. That you try, like, American companies try to file patents there, and then it just is used to steal the thing. Like, they just don't care. They just don't care because they don't want to end up in this situation. It's the right strategy, but it's odd because obviously something about it feels wrong when some company develops something and then tries to sell it in China and then it just gets yoinked.
Designs. All the rest were American. For over 60 years, Northern operated mostly on autopilot, assembling American parts using American blueprints. The company atmosphere was described as sleepy and complacent. The CEO at the time joked that you could only get fired for, quote, screwing the boss's daughter, and then only if it was on company premises. Bell Canada was so unsure of Northern that there were multiple times where they considered only 2 options: sell it or shut it down. But there was a third option: break the branch plant cycle. Make a Canadian company self-sufficient. And as we've just seen, the political climate at home had never been more supportive.
Canada.
It's not that Northern lacked smart employees, they just hadn't been in charge of the decision making until now. In fact, Northern's engineers were likely some of the most capable in the entire country. Because of their prior connections to AT&T and Bell Labs, the engineers at Northern Electric were some of the first outside America to be able to reverse engineer and learn about the transistor. By the end of the 1960s, they were the single largest microchip supplier.
That's a
in
macro
Canada.
shit, boy.
They helped build the world's largest microwave comm system, the Trans-Canada Skyway, and they managed to develop an antenna designed to track satellites. But the 60s were still a slow period for Northern. When they began the decade, only 1% of their products were Canadian designs. By 1969, they had only managed to increase that number to 6%. The switchover was going too slowly. The only way to get ahead would be to give Canada its own Bell Labs. BNR, Bell Northern Research. Founded in Ottawa in 1971, it mimicked Bell Labs in every way it could. There was a bounty of $500 for every patent you filed. The atmosphere was like that of a university campus. There was even a signature color, purple, that the employees rallied behind. Even its first president, Donald Chisholm, had been poached from the real Bell Labs. Look, I'm going to be candid for a second here. BNR is the reason I live in the city that I do. My grandfather was one of the founding engineers hired to work there, and he moved my dad's family from Montreal all the way to Ottawa. BNR is not a name most of you would have heard of, and it sadly doesn't have any Nobel Prizes. But so much of the modern communications landscape, the technology that powers the video you're watching right now, was invented in Ottawa. BNR was about to gamble everything to leapfrog Bell Labs.
Canada.
Telephone switches are the most basic building block of a telephone network. Back in the days of Graham Bell, they were originally just sold in pairs, phone A and phone B, and you put them wherever you needed with a giant wire running between them. Obviously, that's not super scalable, so people decided to designate one building in town as an exchange where human operators would physically move wires around to connect different phone lines. This too was phased out in favor of electromechanical contraptions that were the size of entire rooms. This finally gave way to fully electronic switches, which had fewer moving parts, were much less noisy, and overall more reliable. This was the state of telephone technology as the 60s turned into the 70s. Telephone calls had been analog for as long as they had existed, an electronic wave with smooth curves. But since the advent of the transistor, electronic signals could now be sent in binary. Enough ones and zeros could encode any analog signal with enough precision that barely any information would be lost. That was how computers operated, through massive processors crunching thousands of bits and bytes. People realized fairly quickly that if you could combine phones with computers, the possibilities would be endless. Costs would go down, reliability would go up.
I was the first person to think of this. I was in Canada in the late 60s smoking weed, and I just thought, you know what? Phones are cool, computers are cool. What if we put them together? You know what's crazy is people are going to say, like, everyone knew it was a good idea right away. They didn't. People were like, nah, sounds stupid. It was only later that it really caught on.
You could send multiple phone conversations over the same wire. Signal degradation and noise over long distances was far easier to correct. You could also expand into what we now consider basic features like call forwarding or a busy line notification. And maybe, in the far future, you could even use phone lines to send data between two computers. Can you imagine that? Sending something other than voice over telephone lines? That'd be like some kind of network. I don't know, maybe there's a better name for that. The problem with this idea is that digital signals can't talk to analog signals, at least not directly. You need to convert them using a codec. Bell Labs had figured this out.
You guys want to save the world from a brain-rotted skibbity toilet president hitting the nuke button? This is when you go back to. Go back to this time and stop it right here. They didn't know what they were creating, and once we get to the internet, it's all over, okay? This is where you can stop the damage.
In 1963, but the process was so complicated and expensive that it was only worthwhile to do for giant long-distance cables and the connections between huge central offices. There was still no fully digital switch at the local level. There was a full-on race between at least 7 countries to break this digital barrier, and Canada was way in last when it jumped in with BNR. So how did Canada come from behind and win it all? It's because AT&T had become too complacent.
Yikes.
Despite having a huge technological head start, AT&T was telling customers that digital switching wouldn't be available for several more years. See, this is the inherent contradiction of monopolies. Their endless resources allow them to develop the best technology and offer the best service. But because they have such a stranglehold on the market, they sometimes stifle innovations that threaten their business model.
Yeah.
Case in point, answering machines. Bell Labs invented the technology to record.
I mean, it's like Blockbuster and streaming. It's like there's a million examples. It's like digital cameras and Panasonic or no Polaroid. It's there's a million of them. Kodak. Kodak. I'm sorry, Kodak. Xerox. Well, yeah, I guess Xerox. They certainly innovated a lot of things that got stolen. I don't know that they. I don't know. What was working on streaming? I know they had. That's what I'm saying. They had the technology. They knew about streaming, but they were too slow because they didn't want to fuck up their system. Like streaming kills renting videos at the store, and so they'd rather everything just slow down. But someone else come in. Someone eat your lunch.
Phone calls sometime in the 1940s, but AT&T suffocated it, worried that people would stop using phones for business if they knew they could be recorded. Answering machines wouldn't catch on until the 1970s. It was the same with cell phones. Bell Labs first demonstrated a wireless phone in the 1970s, but again, AT&T refused to develop it. Why would they create a competing type of phone that didn't use the billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that they had taken decades to establish? Cell phones wouldn't catch on until the 1990s. It was the same thing with digital switching. AT&T would be required to update its entire technical ecosystem at a huge cost. Not to mention they'd be making their older switches completely redundant. This was an attitude echoed by some executives within Bell Canada. They were certain that a digital switch would kill sales of their just released SP1 model. But as future CEO John Roth would later say, if you're going to be cannibalized, it's best to be cannibalized by yourself.
Based
in
and
1976,
true.
Northern unveiled...
I heard, this is paraphrased, but Jensen said this about GeForce Now. If you guys don't know, like NVIDIA has a GeForce Now streaming service where you can play a high-end, high-graphics game on a shitty laptop where they stream it from the cloud. And like, when you think about it, if that ever gets good enough and low latency enough and popular enough, it kills the need to ever buy a high-end GPU. But it, you know, it's more like someone is going to do it. It might as well, we better be trying to be the one. It's a smart way to think about it, you know? Hashtag ad. I'm just telling you. It's smart for NVIDIA to work on that because to ignore, put your head in your ears and pretend it doesn't exist is bad.
Unveiled their newest switch, the SL1, at a trade show they called Digital World, which they hosted at none other than Disney World. The timing was everything. By committing when everyone else was too hesitant, they had caught the rest of the industry by surprise. Because it was the only one of its kind for nearly 2 years, the SL1 became the best-selling Switch in the world. After that, the size of the Switches just kept increasing. The SL1 became the SL10, then the DMS10, then the DMS100. Northern could handle up to 100,000 phone calls through just a single switch.
No way.
Last time we checked in, Northern made just 6% of their own designs. By 1975, that was 50%.
Sheesh.
And by 1977, they were up to 7%.
Okay, Canada.
This was an unrecognizable company from just 2 decades ago. In fact, this newfound success was worthy of a name change. Northern Electric was far too generic. Everything was electric these days. How about Northern Telecom? It was also a perfect time to go public. In 1973, they go live on the...
Drop the Hearn and calm. It's cleaner. You know what I'm saying? Drop the Hearn, drop the calm.
Toronto Stock Exchange. And a couple years later, they made it into the big leagues, Wall Street. During the 70s, Northern had gone from having earnings of $5 million to $111 million, and the workforce grew to 33,000 people. If Northern was an American company, it would have been ranked 160 on the Fortune 500.
Jeez.
Northern's CEO during this time was a man named John Law, and there's a quote from him that has pretty much become company folklore. He would often go around asking employees what the company made, hoping they'd take the bait. When they inevitably answered with switches, he'd hit them with the real answer. We don't make switching, god damn it, we make money. Look, I'm a sucker for unsubtle metaphors. Northern's first president was a literal former sea captain. For almost 100 years, Northern was shielded from the perils of the open market, only ever sailing close to shore. By going public on the stock market, this was Northern setting out to sea, taking a risk that a Canadian company could go global. And lucky for them, the hammer came crashing down at the perfect time.
Oh yeah.
Helping you stay on top of change today and tomorrow. That's the power of networking.
Buying a phone? Buy the one that phone companies have relied on for over 100 years. Northern Telecom, a voice you'll recognize from a name you know.
Terrible.
Cool it, Rex.
The breakup of AT&T is the picture-perfect definition of hubris. AT&T was the biggest corporation in the world. It employed around 1 million Americans and provided the cheapest and for many decades, the best phone service in the world. For many Americans, they were the only company you could get a telephone from. And it did so through absolutely crushing business tactics. Although the days of literal sabotage were in the past, now it resorted to brutal boardroom takeovers, political lobbying, and fighting tooth and nail to prevent third-party companies from tapping into its network. It had done all of this with the tacit approval of the US government, which granted it the right to exist as a regulated monopoly, one that had an immense role in the US defense industry. The maternalistic image of Ma Bell, however, had been slowly deteriorating for decades. For some people, AT&T was a brute, a bully whose arrogance had gone unchecked for far too long. Service quality had slipped in recent years, and yet phone bills continued to go up.
Yikes.
AT&T finally overstepped when it tried to crush a new rival, and later attempted to ram a bill through Congress, a bill that once and for all would crown it the one telephone company to rule them all. This pissed off just the right people in the Justice Department, which initiated an excruciatingly slow and complex legal battle that played out over a decade and 4 different presidents. Although it initially looked like AT&T would walk away with just another slap on the wrist, to the horror of the executives, they gradually realized that their behemoth wasn't nearly as invincible as they thought it was. The breakup agreement in January of 1982 is perhaps the single most impactful and controversial event in the history of American industry. Unlike the 1956 settlement, which saw AT&T make a few small concessions, this new ruling was a devastating defeat, and it left a massive power vacuum. AT&T had been desperate to keep Western Electric under its control, but in exchange, they had to watch the rest of their empire be smashed
22
into 22 pieces. The local phone
Damn, I thought it was
companies,
14.
the Baby Bells as they were called, could now buy their equipment from anyone they wanted. And of those 22 Baby Bells, Northern snatched up 21. Former Vice Chairman David Weiss said this: "When the divestiture took place, we found that our customers embraced us in a bloody bear hug. They'd been with AT&T and Western Electric all those years and had been taken for granted. In just a couple years, Northern rockets up to become the #2 telecom company in North America, right behind Western Electric. Its much bigger, but now extremely depressed cousin. Previously, Northern had negotiated an unspoken deal with AT&T that they would stay out of their turf. They would only sell to the independents who despised AT&T. But now, the big bad mob boss had been whacked. The impact of this ruling is obvious on Northern's stock price. You can see in 82, when it becomes clear that AT&T is going to have to give in, that Northern begins to slowly tick up.
That's
By
not
the time
slowly.
the breakup becomes
That's
official
fat.
in 84, Northern's stock price is 3 times what it was. It had broken the curse of the branch plant.
Okay,
As
Canada.
of 82, Northern was officially making more money in the US market than in Canada. This was always bound to happen. The market in America is 10 times as big. The real question was how much of it they could capture. The expansion was rapid. Northern began setting up plants in California, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina. Soon there were 13,000 Americans working for Northern. When it came to grand marketing
Canadians are
gestures,
taking our
nothing was too
jobs.
expensive. Northern chartered a cruise ship, the SS Rotterdam, filled with members of the Fortune 500 community, and wined and dined them for days. When an elaborate trade show in Europe was almost shut down due to concerns over poor ventilation, Northern paid to have an expensive hole cut in the roof. With the financial backing of Bell Canada behind them, Northern was unstoppable. Which raises an interesting point. Why did AT&T get broken up, but Bell Canada was allowed to live on? Bell Canada, although it tried very hard, never quite maintained a true monopoly like AT&T had managed to down south. Although at the peak of its power in the early 1900s, it had steadily lost ground ever since. In terms of sheer land mass, the US and Canada aren't that far off, but the vast majority of Canada is extremely remote.
Right.
Maintaining a presence in the less populated regions proved so costly that service was often unreliable, angering the locals. In the Maritimes, Bell itself had been pushed out by some local rivals. In the prairies, the residents were so fed up with the poor service, the provincial governments bought Bell out and turned them into provincial
That's
utilities.
based.
Easily the
we
second
do that with
coolest things the
Spectrum.
prairies have done for us after giving us universal
Spectrum!
health. And BC was so far away that Bell never even bothered to try and get a foothold on the west coast. If Bell Canada had a monopoly, it was restricted to the Windsor-Quebec City corridor, the home of over half the population. Bell Canada had achieved the ideal size, the Goldilocks zone, big enough to dominate the market, but small enough that the politicians left it alone.
How about
the few
that?
attempts at cracking down on Bell's monopoly fizzled out as Canada's regulatory agencies were undermined and overruled by the government. And if I had to hazard a guess, I think Pierre Trudeau and his cabinet were happy to sit back and watch the American telephone company implode so Canada could pick up the scraps. The Canadian-American divide of the 50s continued to surge into the 60s and 70s. JFK hated Diefenbaker for his flip-flopping over the Cuban Missile Crisis. LBJ hated Pearson's guts for not backing them in Vietnam. And then you had Nixon and Trudeau. Two men who could not have been more different in both personality and politics. Whether it was because of Trudeau's open diplomacy.
Hey, babe. Tacos! Yes, 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 yes. I'm very, very hungry for these tacos. God damn, I'm hungry for these tacos. Wait 1 second.
Whoa! It is on! Wow, is this like a Get Smarter Saturday? Yeah, that's why I said like Get Smarter Saturday. Damn, you got it.
Thanks, babe.
I'm reading the fun comments about like Jewelers and Chicken Wokes. Get Tharder Thursday. Man, I love a chicken wok.
Yeah, super fun.
Man, I'm looking at the spinning fish.
Yeah, but you're kind of in the way of my tacos.
Okay, sorry. Alright, thanks.
Thanks, babe. Does your dad like them or no?
Yeah, he did. He did like them.
That's good. I hope he liked them because I wanted his approval on the tacos.
They put a lot of good filling on them.
Yeah, they do that.
Yeah, they're good, you know, but nothing's ever gonna compete with Tijuana tacos.
Yeah, well.
So get over it, alright?
with China and Cuba, or Nixon abruptly announcing a 10% tariff with no warning, the Canadian-US relationship truly hit a low point in the 70s. It was in this climate that Trudeau's minority government, with a push from the left-wing NDP, created FIRA. The Foreign Investment Review Agency was, on paper at least, a way to block foreign takeovers and screen foreign investment that didn't bring, quote, a significant benefit to Canadians.
What the
FIRA
hell, Canada?
was never very popular. The right wing called it overreaching, the left wing called it toothless, and the left wing of the left wing were over in the corner chanting the words nationalization over and over.
The left wing of the left wing in Canada is called the waffle wing. Do they waffle a lot or do they like waffles?
Trudeau himself had not been much of an economic nationalist. He'd been pushed into creating FIRA by a minority parliament, and by the 80s the Liberals were desperately trying to woo back the private sector. Pierre Trudeau had served one of the longest tenures of a PM in the country's history, and his later years had been dominated by issues of national unity and an economic downturn. The East-West divide that had always existed continued to widen. Trudeau's nationalization of the oil industry had made him a pariah in the oil-rich West. Trudeau, a longtime opponent of Quebec's growing separatist movement, had become increasingly unpopular in the province after he pushed through a new constitution without their approval. And the practice known as the 60s scoop had continued well into the 1980s, where Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their parents and placed up for adoption with white families. Others were placed in residential schools, where any and all semblance of Indigenous language, culture, and heritage were forcibly stamped out. This was not a united country. For a multitude of reasons, there were and still are millions of people living within Canada's borders who do not identify as Canadian, who do not identify with this flag. If there had been a strong nationalist movement in the 70s, it had fractured into pieces by the 80s. Bell and Northern were among the leading voices in Canadian capital that were demanding a changing of the guard. High tech, they said, was the industry that would yank Canada out of its recession. They wanted the government that would lower their taxes and reduce trade barriers for expanding into the newly vulnerable US market. They would get their wish in Brian Mulroney. Mulroney and his Tories delivered one of the most lopsided electoral wins in Canadian history. He was cut from the same ideological cloth as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Deregulation, privatization.
Wait, they're also called Tories in Canada? They have the same party names? Is it Labour and the Tories, or do they get rid of it? Liberal and Tories? Okay. Liberals and Conservatives? Oh, they got rid of it. They changed it. Okay.
And the free market. 23 of Canada's 61 crown corporations were privatized.
They got their own
under
Ronald
Mulroney.
Reagan?
FIRA, which was already a rubber stamp
He's not even
machine
an
at this
actor.
point, was dismantled even further and renamed Investment Canada. Its oversight over new investment was completely eliminated, and its ability to block foreign takeovers was scaled back so much, the act has only been invoked a handful of times since. Mulroney declared that Canada was open for business. He didn't see American money as a threat, he openly welcomed it. As public polling around free trade began to shift, he believed that by adopting it as his party's key policy plank, it would carry them through the next election. Critically, though, he would never have considered it if not for his extremely close relationship with Ronald Reagan. Reagan's advisors feared phone calls from Canada because, quote, he could get the president to do anything he wanted. Mulroney was the only foreigner to speak at Reagan's funeral.
That's crazy.
Without this close relationship, free trade between the two countries may never have been adopted. We've only seen small glimpses of it, but the U.S. has a long history of its own economic protectionism. Several times in the past century and a half, American tariffs have sent the Canadian economy spiraling. When it pulled out of a trade deal in 1850, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs during the Great Depression, the Nixon shock of the 70s, and most recently, Ronald Reagan had been promoting a Made in America policy that threatened to block companies like Northern from America altogether. Canadians weren't necessarily afraid of free trade. What they were afraid of was getting the short end of the stick in negotiations with a country that many perceived as a bully.
No, we're
This
not a
was the
bully.
message of Liberal leader John Turner. He considered himself a proponent of free trade, but not a bilateral agreement directly with the U.S. It's one thing to negotiate in the context of dozens of countries coming together. It's another to try and negotiate one-on-one with a country 10 times your size. Thanks to TV ads like this one, free trade became the defining issue of the 1988 federal election.
Since we're talking about this free trade agreement, there's one line I'd like to change.
Which line is that?
Well, this one here. It's just getting in the way.
Just how much are we giving away in the Mulroney free trade deal?
It also culminated in one of the most explosive moments ever to
That's funny. That's a pretty good ad. Makes me pissed off at America, and I'm American. That's good. I'll watch it again.
The Mulroney.
There's one line I'd like to change.
Which line is that?
Well, this one here. It's just getting in the way.
Just how much are we giving away in the Mulroney free trade deal?
It also culminated in one of the most explosive moments ever to happen in a Canadian political debate.
I happen to believe that you've sold us out. I happen to believe that once you...
Mr. Turner, just one second.
Once any
you
nation...
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian. I want to tell you that I come from a Canadian family and I love Canada. And that's why I did it.
We built a country, east and west and north. We
I've been playing for 2 hours. For 2 hours.
Entonces, ven acá. ¿Qué problema me da? ¿Qué problema? Arquivo.
Built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years, we've done it. With one signature of a pen, you've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States, and will reduce us, I'm sure, to a colony of the United States, because when the economic levers go, the political independence is sure to follow.
This moment resuscitated what many had been calling a dead campaign. There had been talks of replacing Turner as leader mid-campaign, but the Liberals surged into first. Ultimately, Turner's past record weighed him down.
It's crazy how one moment, I mean, we're seeing that with this election and fucking Biden in the debate, and just one little thing can fucking one debate. There really is a lot riding on him. Tim Walz had one fucking MSNBC appearance, and now he's VP. It's just crazy.
And the Tories would eventually clinch the election. The free trade agreement would be enacted soon after, and that was that. With the exception of a few staples like lumber or dairy, the playing field had been wiped clean. It was time to get in the ring and start throwing some punches. Northern's success in the 80s was dependent on entering the hostile American market. After having a pair of Canadian CEOs at the helm, it became clear that Northern needed a CEO with connections in Washington. That's how they landed on Edmund Fitzgerald, a former U.S. Marine, part owner of the Milwaukee Brewers baseball team, and the descendant of a wealthy Wisconsin shipping family. Fitzgerald was perfect for the job. As a Republican with extensive lobbying experience, he rallied hard in Washington against new bills that threatened Northern's southward expansion. Although still Canadian, Northern spoke with a fluent American accent when it needed to. The sales numbers spoke for themselves, but the symbolic victories also helped. The telephone switches in the White House, which had previously belonged to AT&T, were now made by Northern. Although America was the main target of Northern's expansion, the 80s was the decade that Northern went global. They expanded into Europe, the Caribbean, the entire Pacific Rim. They truly made history in Japan, becoming the first ever non-Japanese company to install a telephone switch there. And in 1987, Northern had an almost perfect marketing moment fall right into their lap. An earthquake hits just outside of
What
Tokyo.
the hell?
All the switches in the building break as their mechanical parts are torn off. The only exception was Northern's DMS-10, which was fully digital. The trend of American CEOs continued as Edmund Fitzgerald sought out a successor. He chose Paul.
Do you think Canada caused the earthquake in Japan to get the good marketing moment?
What the hell?
I just wouldn't put it past them, you know?
Stern, a former IBM exec who
Let's
had met while
allege
serving
that
on
they
Reagan's
did.
telecom committee. One former VP described Paul Stern as, quote, arguably the most bloated ego of anyone I've ever met. He insisted on being referred to as Dr. Stern, which is one of those things that he can technically do, but is also one of the most annoying things anyone can do. He also assumed the 3 top jobs of president, CEO, and chairman of the board at the same time and embarked on a company-wide PR tour on the corporate jet, reminiscent of a political campaign. All the while, he began hacking and slashing budgets, shutting down factories, and firing VPs who looked at him the
seems like a
wrong
good guy.
way. The 90s were a new decade. Northern Telecom had pretty much just been shortened to Nortel by this point. By 1991, they had
What's the
pulled
name?
even with AT&T in the US switching market, with a 40% share. The new Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, even found time to visit the BNR labs on a visit to Ottawa in 1992, where he jokingly tried to pocket a microchip. BNR, meanwhile, had spent the last few decades working on a new way to send phone calls. The pipes that humans have used to send phone...
Jokingly is very funny. I'm joking. It's a joke. Oh, you got me. Misdirection he puts. Yeah, oh, I steal this one? And he's got another one in his pocket, dude.
Phone calls hadn't really changed much since the 1800s. They started out using iron cables, which, although functional, were highly sensitive to noise and distortion. Early on, many companies made the switch to copper cables, and the world mostly stuck with those for over a century. But now they were hitting their upper limit, and something better was needed. Although they didn't invent the concept, Bell Canada published one of the very first papers on fiber optics in 1966. Using ultra-pure strands of glass, you could pulse lasers to send digital ones and zeros at incredible rates. Unveiled under the name Fiber World, Nortel showcased a line of fiber optic nodes that could achieve transmission speeds of 2.5 gigabits per second.
And I still don't have it in the heart of Los Angeles in the year 2024. This 1990s Canadian invention. I don't have it in one of America's biggest cities fucking 34 years later. With a budget of a lot. I could spend any amount. It's crazy. It's a business expense. It just doesn't exist.
Once again, they had achieved a multi-year head start over their rivals. As the 90s began, Nortel was on the top of the world. Here's a former employee explaining how they did it. The company built great phone systems, and when I say they built them, they really did. They developed their own CPUs, wrote their own operating systems, manufactured all the boards and sheet metal and whatnot. These customers moved slowly. Products were installed and then expected to run for a decade or more, with nothing but backwards compatible upgrades provided during that time. You charged an arm and a leg for what you delivered, and it was very profitable. When you've been at sea for this long, riding the waves of the market, the previous highs and lows begin to feel insignificant. What was once the pinnacle of success is now just a small crest, the halfway point to a bigger and better wave. Nortel had built a 13,000-ton tanker optimized to serve telephone companies, and the sheer momentum of that looked like it would carry them for the next decade. But that momentum would turn out to be a critical flaw. The age of the telephone company was coming to an abrupt end.
Uh-oh.
Our lives are busy.
And now, from Northern Telecom, a solution.
1993 saw a big shakeup in leadership for both Nortel and Canada. Paul Stern's abrasive personality and budget bloodlust was tolerated up until 93 when Nortel's biggest customer, Atlanta Bell, dropped Nortel following a string of reliability concerns. Paul Stern's cuts had reached the R&D centers, and product lines weren't being updated as much as before. Customers were noticing, and they began to lose ground to AT&T again. Previously heralded as a genius, Paul Stern's tactics were now seen as short-sighted, and he was painted as a tyrant. Bell Canada intervened by blocking the appointment of Stern's close friend as president, instead slotting in one of their own, Jean Monty. Furious at being undermined, Paul Stern resigned in protest. The Paul Stern years are not remembered fondly at Nortel, and if he had any lasting legacy, it was beginning the tradition of lucrative golden parachutes. When he resigned in disgrace, he left the company with $5.4 million in compensation. Jean Monty quickly promoted to...
That's nothing. Some of these golden parachutes now are like... Dude, the most famous one that I know is... there was this guy... How did I forget his name? Michael Ovitz. Michael Ovitz was the greatest agent in Hollywood. He represented all the big superstars. Jack Nicholson, whatever. Tom Cruise, everyone. Okay? Bobby Kotick is a great one too, but Michael Ovitz. Michael Ovitz, at the peak of his power, like the most powerful agent in Hollywood as every star, Disney tries to poach him. They say, you know what? Why don't you stop working for the actors, start working for the studios? Come over to Disney, you can be the president. He gets to Disney. He's the biggest douchebag Disney has ever dealt with. All he does is name drop. He has no ideas. He walks around like a douchebag. He's like, oh, I just got the phone with Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise, maybe you know him. He's just awful. Like, nobody at Disney likes him, and they're all like serious people that have worked there for a while. Disney at the time is like very dominant. And they eventually just go and say, hey, I won't work for this guy. So I think 8 to 10 months into his time as president, supposed to be president and CEO eventually, but they were doing a trial run. There's like a mutiny, and they basically say him or us. And so the CEO fires him. But his parachute is like, I think it's $100 million, which for the time, I mean, for any time is amazing, but for the time is like absurd. So they pay him like $100 million for 8 months of work to do nothing, and he has never really worked again. He tried to start he couldn't go back to his old company because they didn't want him there either. It was $130 million. I'm sorry, $130 million. $130 million severance package. He tried to go back to being an agent, but it turns out everyone hated him, and they wouldn't let him back in. And he had signed away all of it as part of the deal because you can't represent talent and the studios. So he had signed away all of his rights and all of his stock and everything. He had no... So he was very furious, and then he ended up blaming the Jewish conspiracy for running him out of Hollywood, and ended up just fucking sitting around with all his money. A crazy story. Crazy story.
CEO had his work cut out for him. 1993 was the middle of a deep recession in Canada, and Nortel's stock...
I believe he is Jewish. He did not blame the Jewish conspiracy. He blamed the gay conspiracy. I forgot. No. He said there was a cabal of gays. I remember he said, who's the guy? Jeffrey Katzenberg, I think, over it. He had a couple people who were like, these guys are part of the gay mafia. The gay mafia, that's what he called it. The gay mafia of Hollywood has conspired to keep me from success. Very, very hilarious story. Quibi guy. Later known as the Quibi guy, but at the time, different.
Price reflected that. Speaking of the recession, oh boy, did people hate Brian Mulroney. Plagued by scandals and unpopular policies, Mulroney resigned from politics just months before his party suffered the worst election defeat in Canada's history, forever dooming the PCs to irrelevance. The pendulum finally swung back to the Liberals, seeing former cabinet minister Jean Chrétien ascend the PM's office. If Mulroney was our Reagan, then Chrétien was our Clinton. A Liberal, yes, but a Liberal who had been pushed to the right by a decade of conservative rule. The Chrétien years would be defined by an obsession with cutting the deficit. Housing, healthcare, nothing was off limits as long as the number went down. Chrétien had also partially campaigned on renegotiating NAFTA, a revised free trade agreement that would now include Mexico, but he didn't try very hard. Negotiations had been pretty much finalized by Bush and Mulroney, and reopening the terms was just as likely to kill the deal altogether, which was a political no-go. The asymmetry between the two countries meant there was very little weight Canada could throw around. Even then, on a personal level, Chrétien was not sympathetic to the Canadian nationalists. As finance minister, Chrétien had once been in charge of FIRA, but he had always felt that American money in Canada was a necessary pill to swallow. Years earlier, he had said that there were, quote, a lot of places in Canada where people don't give a damn who owns what. They want a job. And years later, he said, protectionism is not left-wing or right-wing. It is simply passé. The free trade debate had effectively been settled. This new political paradigm was followed by radical changes in Canada's telecom policy. And by that, I mean massive deregulation. It was a burning down of the entire playing field in the name of increased competition. Bell Canada's monopoly on long-distance calls was broken. Their preferred supplier agreement with Nortel was torn up. Phone companies could be TV companies now. TV companies could be phone companies. Cell phones were a thing now too, and everyone was welcome to take a crack at those. To survive, you could no longer be just a telephone company. You needed a thumb in every pie. The US underwent its own version of this with the Telecom Act of '96. The Telecom Act is mainly remembered for flooding the tech market with a bunch of new capital and planting the seeds for the eventual dot-com bubble. But it also initiated a wake-up call at AT&T. The last decade had been brutal for them. More specifically, Western Electric was weighing them down. All the new Baby Bells and independent telephone companies refused to buy from them because their money would still just be going to their biggest rival.
Right.
And so AT&T said, fine, we get the message, we'll just spin it off. Western Electric was no more. It underwent a makeover and adopted a fancy new name. Longtime fans might recognize this one. Lucent Technologies. Nortel and Lucent mirrored each other in the same way that the US and Canada mirrored each other. The difference was just size and prestige. Lucent was the industry's 900-pound gorilla, over twice as big as Nortel. B&R was respected, sure, but Bell Labs had 6 Nobel Prizes, and their latest hotshot physicist was bound to win them another. Nortel going public in the 70s was a success, by Canadian standards, but Lucent's IPO, it shattered the world record for most money raised, $3 billion in 1996. Lucent would quickly become one of America's most widely held stocks. If you were betting on either of these two companies, Lucent would be the logical choice.
Watch out,
both of them, at their core, were telephone companies. Neither was truly prepared for the technological upheaval that was going to define the 1990s. Something more radical, unrestricted, and unpredictable than the telephone.
Cryptocurrency!
You see, there's this new thing called the World Wide Web, a network that brought together text, images, voice, even video, albeit heavily compressed. All of it viewable on personal computers that were beginning to pop up in middle-class houses. The telephone took 50 years to reach around half the US population. The internet did it in 5. As it turns out, the copper wires most people had in their houses to receive phone calls worked just as well when it came to delivering internet traffic. Telephone companies like Nortel were remarkably well positioned to gobble up this new internet market. Or at least they would be if they weren't stuck in their old habits. If Lucent represented the old guard, the establishment, then Cisco represented the next generation. A relatively new company, it was an internet startup fresh out of Silicon Valley. It had blazed a trail in the 80s as the brainchild of 4 Stanford professors and quickly ate up a huge share of the telecom market. Whereas Lucent had decades of AT&T's legacy behind it and a massive scale, Cisco was small, maneuverable, and adaptive. Its CEO was a cool guy. He raced speedboats. And most importantly, it had picked the correct side in a civil war being waged by a bunch of nerds. The two factions were called the Bellheads and the Netheads, and they each had a competing vision for how the internet should be transmitted. The Bellheads were most often legacy telephone engineers who worked for companies like AT&T and Bell. They championed something called ATM switching, asynchronous transfer mode. On the other hand, you had the Netheads, fans of IP, or internet packet switching. Netheads were likely to be open source nerds working out of universities, or maverick tech entrepreneurs working out of Silicon Valley startups, desperate to try and disrupt the AT&Ts of the world. The Bellheads loved ATM because it built off the same principles of telephone switching. When you set up a telephone connection, you want a live, continuous conversation. No buffering. You set up a link between points A and B and shut out all other traffic. It's fast and high capacity. It's not so great though if one point along the route breaks down. Now you have to reroute and set up an entirely new connection. That's where packet switching excelled. Packet switching is like mailing someone a jigsaw puzzle, but each individual piece can get split up and take a different route to the destination. It doesn't matter because once they all reach the destination, they just get assembled into, say, an email. IP by its very nature is decentralized, immune to single points of failure, and
It's
notably
like the crypto.
very hard to track customer billing with, which frustrated the bellheads to no end. ATM was ideal for the high-capacity optical fiber networks that Nortel and Lucent specialized in, whereas IP was best used with Ethernet cables and routers that Cisco had built its fortune off of. In the 80s, it wasn't super clear who was winning this civil war, but by the mid-90s, it was. It was the netheads. IP was king, and by the end of the decade, ATM was just going to be another forgotten technology like Betamax was to VHS. If you wanted to use the internet, you had to endure this sound and hope that no one else at home was expecting a phone call. No one wanted on-demand, real-time video calls in this era. They were happy with emails, slow-loading websites, and if they were feeling fancy, downloading software from the internet. Activities where buffering and latency didn't matter. ATM was, on paper, the better technology, but the market had committed to IP. Nortel needed to course correct as soon as possible. This is when we meet John Rock. He's what you'd call a company man. A Canadian, he grew up in Lethbridge, Alberta, and joined Nortel in 1969.
I'm just wondering, because if the ATM guys had won, we'd all have fiber optic, right? It would just be drastically more expensive. Well.
Although he went to school for electrical engineering...
Linkus DM? Wait, pause for a second. You guys don't know, if you just joined, I told Linkus to watch episode 1 of The Boys at his fiance's request. And now we are getting his review 45 minutes later. Let's see. Let's see what Linkus thought of Amazon Prime's The Boys. Here's this. I'll try to do it in my best Linkus voice. Wow. Wow. Girl blows up like a watermelon, and I said, what the fuck, out loud, and just felt shocked. At first, I thought it was going to be a fairly basic and plain show about evil superheroes, but it kept adding more interesting depth to it with corruption and government and other stuff like that. I'm going to binge watch it. I feel attached and want to know more. Great show so far. I sold it. That's marketing at work. That's marketing at work, folks. Okay? I did the pitch. I appealed to his Swedish nature. 2 hours later, he's hooked for life. Okay? You should consider a career in marketing? Yeah, well, I got a better one now. It's a much harder job, but... all right, let's see.
His true talents were not in design. During his entire career at Nortel, he never made it onto a single patent.
Cringe!
He was instead destined to climb the corporate ladder, and at just 35 years old, he rolled into IP. He was told around 2 years, which was too slow for him. On the other hand, I've heard first-hand accounts that Nortel's engineers had a good grasp on IP, and had even published some papers on it in their in-house journal. One of those papers even described a device extremely similar to the iPhone. whole decade ahead of time. There appears to be a disconnect. John Roth and the executives he surrounded himself with did not trust their own engineers, that they were dinosaurs who were stuck in their ways. This is perhaps the reason that Nortel made the controversial decision to shut down B&R. In 1996, B&R and its 17,000 employees was dissolved and absorbed into the rest of Nortel. The Bell Labs of Canada no longer existed. The name B&R, beloved by those who worked there, was erased unceremoniously. In the span of just one weekend, the corporate logo cops paid a visit to Ottawa and had removed every trace that the name B&R ever existed. For some longtime R&D folks, it felt like, quote, a dagger to the heart. Why B&R was dissolved is a bit of a mystery. It's possible it wasn't profitable on its own, viewed as a multi-billion-dollar sinkhole that couldn't exist in this new era that saw Bell downgraded from its long-distance monopoly. By some, B&R's culture was viewed as arrogant. They saw themselves as better than the rest, even down to their insistence that they use Macs instead of PCs. They needed to be reined in, brought into line with the same cost controls and accountability as the rest of the company. Executives began to place less emphasis on Nortel as a hardware company and more so as a software company that specialized in networks. If John Roth needed R&D, he would have to find it elsewhere. And thus began the intense speculation of a merger. For months in 1998, there were rumors swirling in the business press that two of the big three may pair up. Any partnership that emerged would almost certainly be able to crush the odd one out. Nortel and Lucent would be massive. Complete domination in the telephone market, and their combined size could easily fund the R&D to catch up to Cisco in IP. A combo of Lucent and Cisco or Nortel and Cisco would be the perfect marriage of legacy telephone tech with cutting-edge IP technology. How far along any of these talks got is unclear. Lucent and Nortel had a huge product line overlap. Any merger would make huge sections of the new company redundant, and rumors of a merger between Lucent and Cisco caused the FTC to jump in and say, hey, we might block this because this is maybe a monopoly. There was also a fair amount of personal animosity between the three companies' CEOs that made any deal with Lucent highly unlikely. Richard McGinn, CEO of Lucent, had infamously hung up wanted posters of John Roth and John Chambers inside offices as a way to motivate his employees. A move that the other two found tasteless. Furthermore, Lucent had recently poached 3 top Nortel execs, and then they went on to sue Cisco over patent infringement. By this point, the only merger that made any sense was between Nortel and Cisco. And so in June 1998, John Roth makes an announcement that would forever change the trajectory of the entire industry. A decision that would set Nortel on the path to become the most valuable company in Canada. John Roth announces that he is buying the IP switching company Bay Networks for $9.1 billion. He's buying Cisco's biggest competitor. John Roth had set off a 3-way arms race.
Do you know that sound? Of course you do.
It's the high-speed wireless internet. It can reach all kinds of neat stuff. Oh, cool. Want to see live video of the accident?
No, thanks.
Internet's been around for 2 years and your daughter's already looking up fucking live leaks? That's fucked up.
If you ask a dozen ex-Nortel employees what killed Nortel, I'm willing to bet a third of them would say Bay Networks. Not because it delivered the killing blow, but instead because it was the first of many increasingly bad decisions. It just took a while for everyone to realize the mistake. When Nortel acquired Bay Networks, it was anything but ordinary. It cost $9.1 billion, staggering for the time. Cisco had acquired around 5 companies in the years leading up to it, but each had a price tag that only ran into the millions. Bay was not a small company, and in fact had been the product of an earlier merger. They had around 7,000 employees, most of them in Silicon Valley, all of whom were immediately added to Nortel's workforce. Bay Networks was such a huge add that Nortel even got one last name change, becoming Nortel Networks. The company's CEO, Dave House, was immediately made Nortel's new president, right under John Roth. The two went on a worldwide press tour where they were seen by some as, quote, Batman and Robin. Yet despite all the fanfare, the purchase was greeted by the markets with a resounding thud. People honestly thought John Roth had blown it. Bay was way over the hill. Their product line had already matured too much, and they had way overpaid. During fall 1998, the stock price tanked, and many thought that John Roth would be out the door far sooner than expected. But then, Lucent blinked. See, Lucent had actually been one of Bay Network's biggest customers. The Nortel purchase had completely locked them out of the IP space, and management began to panic. And so in January 1999, Lucent buys Ascend Communications, the next biggest company comparable to Bay Networks. Except they paid a much steeper price than Nortel did. A whopping $20 billion. If people thought Nortel...
It's like all the AI acquisitions happening right now. Every company that's late to AI is just paying through the fucking nose for like any team of 8 AI engineers in Silicon Valley.
Had overpaid. Then Lucent got fleeced. Ascend had been doing so poorly, brokers jokingly called it ass end. Following this example, Cisco, which had already been buying companies at a frantic pace, went into absolute Pac-Man mode and gobbled up 18 companies in just 1999. The next year, Cisco's grand total would stand at 64 acquired companies. And Lucent was no slouch either. Bingo, bango, bongo. John Roth had every reason to be smug, and he took a shot at Cisco, saying, "We can learn to spell IP faster than Cisco can learn to spell reliable." Look, you gotta hand it to the man. He's got sick burns.
So you're happy with the Bay purchase?
Absolutely.
And you feel you paid the right price?
Well, it looks like a bargain now in retrospect compared to some of the other deals that are going down.
Okay.
Feeling vindicated now, John Roth had permission from Nortel's board to go on a shopping spree.
Oh, shit.
Between the years of 1999 and 2000, Nortel bought a new company at an average rate of 1 per month. Some were small firms with just one exciting R&D project. Others were well-established industry names. Bay Networks would remain their most expensive purchase, but more than a few of them crossed over the billion-dollar threshold. Altian Web Systems was grabbed for almost $6 billion, yet another big player in the Ethernet and IP space. Kairos went for $3 billion. With just 90 employees, they were developing a cutting-edge technology that would enable optical switching using tiny microscopic mirrors. This shopping spree was indiscriminate, and at times appeared to lack a clear focus.
Yeah.
One of Nortel's other major purchases was Clarify, an e-commerce firm acquired for $2.1 billion. Exactly why John Roth wanted to take his telecom firm into the world of customer relations software is unclear. Frankly, some of these purchases were made entirely so that Lucent and Cisco couldn't have them. With every new acquisition came hundreds and in some cases thousands of new employees. Nortel ballooned from 74,000 employees up to 95. In some towns like Richardson, Texas and Maidenhead in Britain, Nortel was the single biggest employer. The right angle turn was a full-blown corporate makeover. Employees would walk into the office and see a giant right angle arrow decorating the floor. This was a company that was fast. From 1997, Nortel went from spending just 5% of their R&D on internet to over 60% in 1999. Nortel's fiber technology went from 2.5 gigabits per second up to 10, 4 times faster than anyone else in the world. Nortel used to plan its projects in years, with full life cycles often being decades, because that's what telephone companies wanted. Roth insisted on a new time frame, web years, really just fiscal quarters, because that's how fast the new economy was moving. And he wasn't wrong. Internet startups had exploded in the last couple years. In 1995, Netscape had an IPO that raised almost $3 billion in just one day. It seemed like anyone who could code a website in their garage could become a millionaire overnight. And Nortel had to accommodate that. Just look at the way its marketing evolved in the past decade. This is a sales video from the 80s.
Meridian One communication systems are leading worldwide with over 50,000 digital voice and data systems installed, ranging in size from 30 to 60,000 lines. Now, whether you need 30 lines or 200 lines, the new Meridian One Option 11 will enhance your business success without the nightmares.
Snoozer.
And this is a new employee training video from around Y2K.
And in joining us, you are instantly connected. So here's what you get.
Advanced technology.
The world is your palette.
Research and development.
Shaping the way that people will communicate in the future.
Pretty tight, cohesive teams.
This is where the action is.
You are now instantly connected. This is how you connect. This is where you connect.
Welcome to Nortel Networks.
Welcome to Nortel Networks.
Welcome to Nortel Networks.
Even promotions were fast. Tim Dempsey recalls that he spent on average 18 months in any given role. Quote, "We sometimes counted bosses per year instead of years per boss." Another employee I spoke to mentioned that they had 5 different managers in the same year. Some of them they never even met in person. Even John Roth, the person, was fast. The business press had latched on to his obsession with fast cars. Finally, there was something interesting they could write about.
Are you still buying used parts for your 66 Jag over the net?
Well, it's in pretty good shape now, so I moved on to other things. Last day, my wife and I bought some oil paintings over the net.
Meanwhile, in the background of all of this, the rest of Canadian high-tech had undergone what can only be described as a gold rush. Throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, engineers who first got their start at Nortel had been leaving to found startups. And then those startups led to startups, creating a multi-generational family tree that led back to Nortel. Mitel, Corel, Newbridge, Mosaides, Calian, Gandalf, Memtech, Epitech, Lumonix, Sotronics, Nabu, Orcatech, Norpac, Canadian Astronautics, JDS. By Y2K, in the Ottawa region, there were over one...
JDS is so funny. JDS Uniphase, dude. Can I show you? This is... Yeah. This is a famous example. This is JDS Univase's stock chart. Fucking just an all-timer, dude. Just an all-timer. Buy the dip. It's bouncing back. It's due.
1,000 companies employing 75,000 people, and 1 in 5 of them belong to Nortel. Ottawa's tech scene in the 1990s actually grew faster than the real Silicon Valley, earning it the nickname Silicon Valley North. City Council even tried to rebrand with a new slogan, which did not go over well. You ready for this? The City of Ottawa. Technically beautiful. I'd make a joke here, but a city councilor already beat me to it. If I called my daughter technically beautiful, she'd hit me. Nortel was proudly Canada's single largest spender of R&D. In 2000, it spent $5.9 billion, which, no exaggeration, is more than every other company combined. The Nortel recruitment process at universities was so robust, some likened it to hockey talent scouts. At one point, 1 in 5 engineering grads in Canada were being hired by Nortel. 1 in 5. If you had a master's or PhD, that rose to 1 in 3.
Crazy.
From everyone I've spoken to, every interview I've read, Nortel in the 90s was one of the best places to work in Canada. You were paid well, and if you wanted to take a training course, they'd pay to send you. The job wasn't just, here, do this task. It was more like, what can I do to make your job easier? A local car dealer told a newspaper that if Nortel didn't exist, half of his customers would disappear overnight. Dress code was lax. No time clock, an in-office gym, and they threw legendary parties every other week. One recruiter called it a corporate Disneyland. And this next...
Well, that reminds me of like Silicon Valley in 2014. You know, working at Twitch. Just fucking... parties, beer at the office, free drinks, free meals 3 times a day. Just before Amazon came in and said, hey, it doesn't make any money. You know?
It sounds like a fake fact, and I can't confirm this, but I want it to be true. Nortel may have hosted North America's largest recreational softball league, with 6 different skill tiers and thousands of players. Nortel had transformed the image of an entire capital city. It had helped to rebrand Canada as more than the place where you got lumber, dairy, and maple syrup. Nortel was a company that was defining what tomorrow looked like.
Okay.
And nowhere was this more crystallized than in their latest ad campaign. Nortel had splurged for the rights to use the Beatles song Come Together, an on-the-nose slogan.
They spent on a Beatles song for the fucking ad?
Now, you might wonder, why does a company like Nortel even run ads in the first place? Most Nortel products aren't something the average consumer could walk into a Best Buy and pick up off the shelf. No, these ads weren't trying to sell you on the tech. They were selling you on the brand. The average person may not buy a Nortel switch, but they could certainly buy Nortel stock. Strap in.
What a pump.
You're about to witness a once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon I like to call the Toronto stock explosion.
Nortel Networks is changing the way businesses communicate.
Hi, I've got a package for Germany.
And with the internet, that's going to explode.
It's been a hot minute since I updated our little stock tracker back here, and that's because to truly appreciate what you're about to see unfold, you need to take a peek behind the curtain. In the year 2000, approximately 75% of North America's backbone internet traffic was carried through Nortel equipment.
That's incredible.
Nortel was bringing in revenues in the hundreds of millions. But that's not how the stock market works. The stock market, by its very nature, is speculative. People are paying prices based on what they think a company should be worth in the future. So although you can look at things like sales, assets, business deals, acquisitions, a lot of it comes down to guesswork. In 1993, Nortel was bringing in 25 times as many sales as Newbridge Networks, and yet Nortel was only worth 1.5 times what Newbridge was in market cap. Share price is not a reflection of some universal value. There's no formula you can punch a bunch of numbers into and get a single objective number. Sometimes the people trading the stock have no idea what they're talking about. Other times people know a little too much about a stock. And in some cases, the mechanics of the market are just plain being exploited. Due to its peculiar position in the Canadian economy, Nortel had hijacked the rules of the game and had found a way to print money. This is how they did it. Stocks are traded on stock markets. Whether that's in person or through a computer, doesn't matter. A company like Nortel trades on a lot of different markets. London, Tokyo, New York. They sell their shares wherever they're allowed. Same product, different stores. Some markets are more competitive than others. Your company needs to be a big deal to get listed on Wall Street, for example. And even then, you're probably going to be a small fish in a big pond. Nortel did well on Wall Street. In 2000, Wall Street listed its top 20 foreign stocks, and only 4 were Canadian. 3 of them were Barrick Gold, Alcan Aluminum, and Placer Dome. In other words, mining and resource extraction. Nortel was the only tech stock. But where Nortel truly shined was in its home arena, back on Bay Street, at the Toronto Stock Exchange.
TSE.
On the TSE, Nortel was the MVP. First things first is the currency issue. Although Canadians often invest in American companies, every time we make a trade, we're taking a small hit due to the currency conversion, which can add up over time. But on top of that, Canada actually has laws that puts a cap on the percentage of foreign securities you can have in certain investments.
Interesting.
Mutual funds, RRSPs, you're generally capped to somewhere.
Oh my god, so everyone's retirement had to hold a few bubbly stocks? Is that what you're telling me? That's so interesting.
20 to 30% for foreign stocks. These two factors explain why Canadians were biased towards Canadian stocks, but it doesn't explain why there was a sudden surge of investing in the year 2000. For that, we can look at 2 recent changes. The first was a change in pensions. I'm very sorry, I have to do this. This is actually necessary. The 2 main types of pensions are defined benefit and defined contribution.
Like the warning.
A defined benefit pension is when both
everyone's
you
eyes
and
glaze
your employer
over.
pay into it, but it's fully on them to manage it. When you retire, they are obligated to pay you an agreed upon amount per month. This is the type of pension that most Canadians had at this point. But by the late 90s, there is a big push to transition over to the other type of pension. In a defined contribution pension, you and your employer both still put money into it, but now it's on you to manage it. You are responsible for your money. Low risk, high risk, whatever you want, but the amount you get at retirement is now entirely on you. The Liberal government was eager to transfer over huge swaths of its employees over to defined contribution pensions. That included the workforces of Canada Post, the Armed Forces, the Mounties, and the gargantuan Public Servants Alliance. That was hundreds of thousands of pensions and tens of billions of dollars that was going to be sunk into the Canadian stock market. Even the Canadian Pension Plan, the old age social safety net for almost half the country, was about to invest its surplus of $2 billion right into the market. This was on top of the pension funds that were already heavily invested in the market, like $35 billion from Ontario's civil servants and $68 billion from Ontario's teachers. The second big increase in investment was due to the capital gains tax. A capital gain is any profit you make on an investment, which includes stocks. At the start of the year 2000, the capital gains rate was 75%, meaning 75% of any profit you made would be considered income and taxed according to your tax bracket. But by February, it had been lowered to 66%, and then to 50% by October. Anytime the capital gains tax is lowered, it leads to a surge of new money flowing into the market. You saw the same thing happen in the US when they cut their capital gains rate in 1997. With more upside to potential trades, the average Joe was willing to try their hand at the stock market. And this was the late 90s too. Technology had made trading more accessible than ever before. In the olden days, if you wanted to invest, you had to go to a bank, get a broker, call them on the phone, and then tell them to make a trade for you. That's so passé. People were quitting their full-time jobs to sit at home on the computer and trade stocks on the internet. You can see here the beginnings of what might turn into a
2021 code.
Canadians need to invest in Canada, so they invest in the latest big name, Nortel, which goes up in price, which then generates positive media coverage, and so on and so on. But we're just getting started here. The wheels are still firmly on this wagon. The last piece of the puzzle here is something called an index fund. Stock exchanges employ a lot of metrics, stats. It's useful to have just one number to track, an index, that represents how good the exchange is doing. Now, you've probably heard of the Dow Jones or the S&P 500. Essentially, they try to boil down the entire market into just the top 30 or 500 stocks. Some, like the Dow Jones, use what is called price weighting, where a company's fraction of the index is their market cap divided by the total number of shares. Others, like the S&P 500, use what is called float weighting. For a given stock, their contribution to the index considers both their total market cap as well as the total number of shares available to the general public. That's two variables. If you were to put this into a pie chart, today's S&P 500 looks a bit like this. The behemoth tech firms like Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon take up big chunks because of their billions of shares. But most of the pie is made up of tiny slices. An index fund is a type of investment that tries to track a pie chart just like this. If I put in $1,000 and Google is 5% of the pie, then 5% of my $1,000 goes into Google. Every time the index updates, so does my investment. In the ultra-competitive market of the US,
what if there were 3 companies that were each individually over 6%? And that combined they were about 20, so about a fifth of all money was going to just these 3 companies. That'd be fucking crazy.
No one company has clear dominance, resulting in a nice and diversified portfolio. I won't see a huge chunk of money disappear if one company goes under. But what if you add a smaller, less competitive market? Could one company with a particularly massive number of shares take over the index?
This is so interesting. I did not...
This is the TSE 300. It's one index that combines the performance of top 300 companies listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. In October 1998, Nortel's share of the TSE 300 was less than 5%, lagging just behind its parent company, BCE. But by September of 1999, it had taken the top spot, grown to 8%. 1 month later, it was 10%, by November it was 11%, and by the end of January, it would be 16%.
Okay, like what I'm saying, that is basically equivalent of what NVIDIA, Microsoft, and Apple are combined in the S&P 500 right now. That's crazy. For one company to be... That's a level of concentration that's so fucking absurd. It's so much risk for someone trying to get diversification. You're buying 300 stocks, but almost a fifth of everything is going into one.
What is going on here? Well, for one, Nortel's share price is going up. But that's just one half of the picture. You see, Nortel's total share count was rapidly multiplying. Where had all these new shares come from? Normally, the number of shares a company has is fairly arbitrary. A company with 100 shares and a company with 1 million shares could have the same market cap, simply because one has a much higher share price. Sometimes companies undergo what is called a stock split. They multiply the total number of shares, say by 2, and divide the price of each share by 2, keeping the total market cap the same. Nortel in its history had undergone 4 stock splits, 2 of them under John Roth, a fact he was happy to brag about. However, a stock split in a vacuum is neither a good nor a bad sign. It's just an attempt by a company to draw in new investors by making a single share more accessible. It's not like John Roth could just keep doing it like an infinite money glitch. The market would be quick to punish him and take Nortel's stock price. He could go and print new shares as part of employee stock options. And in fact, he did this many times. Nortel was notorious for handing out stock options like candy. Even the janitor got some. Over just a few years, he had printed a hefty 161 million new shares. This too, though, wasn't something he could do over and over. Many of Nortel's largest shareholders complained that their shares were being diluted. If Nortel wanted more shares, they would have to get creative. Enter the Butterfly Plan.
Okay.
So by
I'm
this
interested.
point, Nortel's parent company, Bell Canada, now renamed BCE, owned the largest chunk of Nortel's shares, 39%. So John Roth, although powerful, couldn't unilaterally make decisions without first getting the approval of his boss, Jean Monty, and the rest of the board. Without Bell's monopoly money and a preferred supplier agreement, Nortel would likely have gone under decades ago.
Okay, they need daddy.
But BCE wasn't a monopoly anymore, and Nortel had quickly outgrown its parent. In the year 2000, BCE's stake of Nortel made up 78% of BCE's total value. Think about
This is like after, you know, this is like the end of Yahoo's life. 2016 Yahoo, I think they owned $30 billion worth of Alibaba stock. And it was worth so much more than everything else Yahoo still had. Like Yahoo as a company was worth like maybe $1 billion. And then they had $30 billion of Alibaba stock they owned because they invested early. I'm pretty sure, I don't remember exactly how, but I think they spun it off into its own company that all it did was own Alibaba stock. Because the Yahoo part was dragging that down. It was dragging just the part that sat there and owned Alibaba.
about that. This is the country's largest telephone, internet, and TV provider. Nortel's revenues had grown 26% in 1999. The entirety of BCE's other holdings only grew 5%. Owning Nortel right now seems like a good problem to have, but Jean Monty wasn't entirely pleased with the situation. Nortel distorted BCE's numbers so much that the market was likely undervaluing BCE's stock price. And because they no longer had a majority stake, he was fine with simply divesting their shares. That would mean more autonomy for both BCE and Nortel, which would allow Monty to pursue his goal of creating a domestic media empire. Thanks to the deregulation of the past decade, later that year, BCE would go on to acquire the country's largest private news company, CTV, as well as a major newspaper in the Globe and Mail, as well as dozens of local news stations. Selling off Nortel would allow both companies to divide and conquer, with BCE...
We love media conglomerates, don't we, folks? We love when so many of our different papers and news organizations are owned by the same few people. It's good. You get a lot of different opinions. It's awesome. Love that.
Taking on media and Nortel taking on tech. The question was how to give away the shares. You would think that they would just sell them, make a killing, and pocket the cash, but the resulting tax cost would be immense. So they decided to instead push that onto the shareholders. They came up with a plan known as the butterfly distribution, where for every BCE share that you held, you'd keep that share, but also gain 0.78 Nortel shares. And the total amount of Nortel shares would be split, doubling in number. If you're lost, that's honestly okay. But the bottom line here is that there were now an additional 502
So they just gave it to their shareholders.
Nortel
Okay.
shares on the open market. Before this, BCE was the most widely held stock in Canada. Now, it was Nortel. This immediately increases Nortel's weighting on the
it goes
TSE
higher?
300. The butterfly plan brought Nortel from 16% up to 26. 1/4 of the entire
That's
country's premier stock
disgusting.
exchange was
That's
simply
such a disgusting level of
But
concentration.
we're not done here. We've got room to keep
Oh
going
my
up.
God.
The butterfly plan was a one-time thing. If John Roth wanted a license to print shares, he needed a repeatable strategy. He found one in Bay Networks. I said earlier it cost Nortel $9.1 billion to acquire them, but I didn't mean $9.1 billion in cash. No, Nortel had paid for it with shares. John Roth had gone to the company treasury with the permission of the board and printed 134 million new shares, which were handed over to the executives and employees of the newly acquired company. Now, there was a little worry about share dilution, but so long as the share price continued to go up, John Roth was able to keep his investors happy. The TSE 300 immediately accounts for all these new shares in Nortel's weighting. This, in turn, causes all index funds in the country to go out and purchase more Nortel shares, which has the cyclical effect of raising Nortel's share price. which also, again, factors into Nortel's weighting. Can you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Nortel acquired 18 companies in 2 years, and of the $30 billion it had spent, $22 billion was paid for with shares. The shopping spree had injected 972 million new shares into the market. And here's another thing. Not all of these shares printed for these acquisitions were actually available on the open market. If you print a bunch of new shares and give them to employees, they're getting a gift for free. Understandably, they don't know if the stock price is going to go up or down, and it's in their best interest to just sell them immediately and make a profit. Millions of shares being dumped right after.
That's what my boss at Twitch told me when I got my Amazon shares. Thank fucking God I didn't listen. Thank fucking God. Actually, I probably did listen. It was too lazy. It seemed like such a pain in the ass. Thank fucking God, though. I remember him telling me that verbatim. Verbatim. Like, you don't know. Like, if you think it's going to go up, you should buy Amazon stock today. But if you're not doing that, then you have no idea. So you should sell. Yeah, okay. It sounds right. And then I went home and played League of Legends, or played Shardbound.
The buyout looks bad on Nortel. Hence, the buyouts usually included an escrow clause. The employees of the acquired company are given the Nortel shares, but they can't sell them until the end of an escrow period, which can be anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half. And yet, even though these new shares aren't technically public, the TSE 300 still increases Nortel's weighting. This triggers another round of index funds trying to buy shares, except there are fewer shares available to actually meet this new demand. This artificial scarcity drives Nortel's share price even higher, which in turn increases its weighting, and around we go. Are you following?
Yeah.
Starting in 1998, Nortel had gone from having around 500 million shares to over 3 billion. Nortel had exploited the intricacies of the Canadian stock market so badly that by the summer of 2000, it made up 38% of the entire Toronto stock.
That is such a dereliction of duty.
Does this make sense? Does this seem fair? I promise you it shouldn't. And then things got worse. So, those index funds we were talking about, with Nortel continually eating more and more of the TSE.
Just, think about it like from the point of view of a pension. Someone's pension is going to buy for their retirement. 40% of the money they're putting in is going to one company at the peak of its value. That's not diversification at all. It's like that's the riskiest portfolio you can imagine.
Pie, index fund managers had to buy more and more Nortel to fill up their clients' portfolios. But sometime around late 1999, they ran into a snag. See, there's actually a law in Ontario that prevents mutual and index funds from having more than 10% of their value in one stock. Maybe you see the issue here. Nortel was now more than 10% of the pie. It was illegal for index funds to match the TSE 300. And that was a problem. See, the reason people go to professional investors is that they're supposed to know better than the average person. But with the market being anywhere from 15 to 25% Nortel, unless your investment manager was a savant or a psychic, there was no reliable way for them to outperform the market. Thanks to aggressive lobbying efforts, on January 28, 2000, the Ontario Securities Commission introduced what many people called the Nortel Rule. Nortel was not explicitly named in this change, but it was the only company the rule impacted. Index funds were now allowed to go over the 10% cap. Mutual fund managers were out of luck, and they were still stuck at 10. The TSE 300 throughout most of the year 2000 was mockingly called the Nortel Index, because all it really told you was whether or not Nortel had a good day or not. At some point, you would think that someone in charge would step in and say, hey, this is kind of like passing a law where you don't have to wear a seatbelt if the car is a convertible and you have the roof down. Safety regulations are optional so long as you're trying to do something cool.
That is a base law.
But no. Remember the Canadian pension plan?
There you go.
80% of it was an index fund tracking the TSE 300.
That's
retirement funds, pensions, personal portfolios all over the country were packed to the gills with Nortel. Canadians were bombarded with Nortel everywhere they looked. It was on the news, it was in commercials. Maybe they knew about it because their uncle worked there and his stock plan was paying for his new kitchen. Or maybe their buddy made $3K off of Nortel thanks to a good trade the other week. Now they've got FOMO. They want to get in on the bandwagon too. They want to make money, obviously, but, deep down there's probably a little part of them that's, patriotic. They're happy they're supporting the home team. Maybe Canada doesn't make its own cars or make its own movies. He glanced over.
Nvidia swings more than $400 billion in a single day, every day for the past week. But have your moment, Ken. It's a different time.
See.
Holy! What a.
Hey, are you dying to watch part 2?
That was a great video. That was a fantastic video. Damn, do we want to finish it? How long is the second part? If it's a full hour and a half, I think I can't do it. I think I can't do it. Let's see.
Big thank you to Nebula for
It is. It's an hour and a half. All right, we'll have to do it tomorrow. I'll watch tomorrow, 100%. 100% we'll watch tomorrow. Absolutely. And I'll do other things tomorrow, too. We'll do a big stream. Big stream tomorrow. But it's midnight. Ari's parents are here. That was a great video. I mean, obviously, I knew it would be good. Everyone recommended it, but that was fantastic. It's right up my alley. Right up my alley. Extremely interesting, and I can't wait to see what happens. I'm assuming it ends by going even further to the moon, and everyone in Canada becomes a millionaire, and they laugh all the way to the bank. And to this day, Nortel is still the biggest and most powerful company there ever was. That's an awesome ending. Happy. We'll watch it tomorrow. All right. Well, thanks for watching. Thanks for spending some time with me. I know I'm a little late today, and I missed yesterday. But overall, the content on YouTube's been killing it, bro. We've been on fire. I got like back to back 1 out of 10s on the clips and I think the main. Everything's been pretty fucking banger. All right. Much love. Thanks for kicking it with me. We'll raid Houdat if he's live. Raid Houdat 950, my goat. Sevens. Thanks to all the non-Americans for sticking around for all of us. Our America Pilled Day about the Olympics. And talk to you soon. Bye. I think now we are going to watch Nortel Part 2. Nortel Part 2. And I can catch, if you don't watch Part 1, I can actually catch you up pretty easy. Although he might do it in the video. Part 1 was amazing. It was a great, interesting.
Big thank you to Nebula.
Business documentary. And what's cool is you are joining right at the peak. The entire first part of the Nortel documentary was covering its dramatic rise from being a small offshoot Canadian branch of an American monopoly. They slowly but surely established their own company, their own brand, and their own technology, and rose to become the most valuable company in Canada. At one point, comprising something like, what was it, 46%? Am I crazy? It sounds too high. 30% of the Canadian stock, 38% of the Canadian stock market. That means every Canadian that was investing in their retirement, if they put $1,000 in, 380 of that was going to the fucking one company. It was absurd. It was absurd. And that is where they're at right now. They're at their peak of their stock price, and surely only good times are ahead. Okay? And this is right around, of course, the rise of the internet and the dot-com bubble in the late 90s, early 2000s, where the internet's going to never stop growing and everything's the future, and Canada's at the forefront. And every company has to buy their internet switches for the future. Okay? We're going to watch that starting now.
Sponsoring this video. When the Edmund Fitzgerald launched in 1958, it was the largest ship to sail on the Great Lakes, just 1 foot below the maximum allowed length of 730.
That's a big ship.
The ship was named for Edmund Fitzgerald Sr., president of Northwestern Mutual out of Wisconsin, and spent 17 years hauling iron ore, setting its record of around 28,000 tons. Because of its imposing size, recognizable colors, and the music it played over its speakers, the boat became a local legend on both sides of the US-Canada border, and earned it the nickname the Titanic of the Great Lakes.
That's not a nickname you
During
want
its history,
as a boat. Just in general, if you're a boat, you don't want to be called the Titanic of anything.
The ship was not without its close calls or minor accidents, but each time it survived and continued on its journeys. And then came November 10th of 1975. After spending a little over a day sailing east on Lake Superior, the Fitzgerald and another ship, the Anderson, began to enter into rough waters. With wind speeds reaching almost 80 kilometers per hour, the captain of the Fitzgerald radioed the Anderson to say, "I have a bad list. I've lost both radars and I'm taking heavy seas over the deck."
Yikes.
They lost radio contact at 7:10 p.m. Minutes later, the Fitzgerald entered into a squall, a highly localized black storm cloud, at which point it disappeared from the Anderson's radar, and the ship and its 29 crew members were never seen again.
Wait,
The
for
wreck
real?
was found 4 days later, 500 feet below the surface, a dozen miles outside Whitefish Bay.
That's surprising to me. I did not think there was so much activity on a lake, even a great one. Oh, thank you for the gifties, real and legit Doug. The real legit Doug gave 5 gifties. Well, that has to be you. That has to be you. Thank you so much. It's basically an ocean. It's not basically an ocean, bro. The lakes are big, don't get me wrong. They're not up there with oceans. I leaked the fucking video I just showed you, bro. I leaked the video I just showed you. The Great Lakes are not equivalent to ocean. That's not a controversial take. The Pacific Ocean and Lake Superior are not in the same weight class.
Bay. It had been torn into 2 gigantic pieces. The lifeboats hadn't been launched.
Thank you, Doug
Doug
Official.
Down
Real.
too fast to react. Although they're called the Great Lakes, their sheer size is such that they're more comparable to inland seas.
Well, that settles that, doesn't it? They're not comparable to inland oceans. I'll tell you that. I'll tell you that right now. Don't say get fucked. He didn't say oceans. He said seas, which we can meet in the middle, but it's certainly not ocean. Okay?
Lake Superior is the largest of the 5, with enough volume to fit the other 4 lakes with room to spare. The weather conditions are often unpredictable and even violent. The waves on Lake Superior that day, particularly on the eastern side, reached an astonishing height of 11 meters. That's as tall as a 4-story house. With the
Okay.
Fitzgerald weighed down with 26,000 tons of cargo, water would have crashed down above the deck by over 4 meters.
Sorry, I won't show it.
¿Por qué? Oh, ni a playa ya. Ya ni a playa, bro. No sale el agua. ¿Por qué no llega el agua?
The largest recorded wave on an ocean, a real ocean, is 18 meters. Just interesting. Interesting that like these paltry waves are like even considered scary. It's like mostly, it seems very lake-sized.
And although it's exceedingly rare, if the air pressure system was just right, a rapid frenzy of wind can generate a rogue wave, over twice the height of the surrounding crests, a column of water so imposing that it would register on a ship's radar. The exact mechanics of the sinking, to this day, are unknown and widely disputed. Even the famous Gordon Lightfoot song captures the multiple possibilities with this lyric. They might have split up, or they might have capsized. They may have broke deep and took water. What exactly sank the Edmund Fitzgerald is a mystery that will never have just one satisfying answer. The best we can do is to analyze the wreckage and make our guesses. In April 1999, Nortel's general counsel, Clive Allen, dropped a bit of a bomb during a roadshow in Ohio. Now, Allen was set to retire in just over a month, and allegedly thought that his remarks would stay within his relatively small audience. He said that Nortel and other tech firms, quote, owe no allegiance to Canada,
Yikes.
and alluded that Nortel may be considering a move to the States. unless the feds slashed its tax rates. Just because we were born there doesn't mean we'll remain there. Canadians shouldn't feel they own us. The comments from Alan were not well received by Canadians. One 72-year-old shareholder said,
"This is how every fucking corporation thinks, though. You know, fucking Apple's headquartered in fucking Ireland. They're all fucking moving to tax havens."
His remarks were gratuitous and nasty, and that nowadays everybody just thinks of themselves. I feel what Alan said was very offensive. Nortel may not owe allegiance to Canada in a legal sense, but it certainly benefited from its close ties to Canada. It was collaborations with the National Research Council and grants and loans from the government that helped kickstart the microelectronics boom in Ottawa, and Nortel had enjoyed years of R&D tax credits.
Yeah.
One estimate in 1993 pegged the total tax credits at around $880 million, and it would be well over $1 billion by Y2K. NAFTA was supposed to have evened the playing field, give Canada a chance to expand into the US. But between 1985 and 2002, there have been roughly 10,000 foreign takeovers of Canadian companies, 6,400 of which were by US companies. 97% of the $140 billion Canadian that had flowed into the country had been spent on foreign takeovers. Was Canada open for business, or was it up for sale? And now the one Canadian company that had broken that cycle was talking about abandoning them. No one wanted a repeat of the Quebec Nordiques moving to Colorado, only to go on to win the championship the very next year. The very idea that Nortel would move down south was...
I don't know shit about hockey, but I assume that's a fucking hockey team going to Colorado and then finally winning. That's very funny.
Insulting, but not unprecedented. 50% of Nortel's sales were in the US compared to just 10% in Canada. The majority of its employees were now American. The recession years under Jean Monty had seen their fair share of Canadian plant closures and relocations. Bramalea, London, Amherst, Canada saw a quarter of its workforce cut, many of them unionized, in favor of cheaper labor available in countries like Mexico and China. And since '97, Nortel had been spending less and less money on political donations in Canada, instead sending more money to Democrats and Republicans with each passing year.
Well, that's good.
Following the controversial comments, John Roth had to go into damage control mode, saying that Allen, quote, communicated very poorly and was not authorized to speak on behalf of the company. Instead, John Roth tried to reframe the issue.
Well, the big issue is that there's a huge incentive for basically people in the upper income. And a lot of our jobs that we have in Nortel basically pay very well. And there's a huge tax differential now between the take-home pay that somebody would experience if they had that job performed in Canada versus they performed the job in the United States. And I think the government really has to pay attention to the fact that a lot of upper-income jobs are moving to the U.S. And this is going to reduce the Canadian tax base in time, and is going to basically impact the standard of living that we all enjoy here in Canada.
This wasn't about Nortel leaving to the U.S., but instead that Nortel was losing its best and brightest to U.S. companies. On average, one Nortel manager a week was being poached by a U.S. company in the year 2000. One Nortel executive was approached midway through his vacation in Greece and was flown out to Silicon Valley that day. They also offered to have his wife flown out so she could view a selection of hand-picked houses and see the various school districts. It doesn't matter that you work for the richest tech company in Canada. U.S. tech has unfathomably deep pockets. One Silicon Valley recruiter explained it like this: optical networking equipment is not something a couple of guys in a garage can create overnight. There is no one in the valley who knows how to do optical transport. We have to import all our guys. Canadian engineers were being offered huge raises, stock options, and yes, even hockey tickets. That last one does sound like a sweet deal on paper, but keep in mind the hockey team was probably the San Jose Sharks.
Okay. Bro, there's so many people on NVIDIA that love the Sharks. I can't get into it. There would be guys. I remember this. I'm not gonna say his name, but he's high up at NVIDIA. He would always show up in the Sharks gear. See, you catch that Sharks game? No, I didn't. I missed this one. I didn't catch that one.
I've been assured that this is a very funny sports joke. The company behind that particular stunt was Optical Networks, of which Cisco was an investor. And Nortel was so infuriated by its antics, they filed a court injunction to stop them from stealing their employees. It had poached 19 employees in 11 months. Worse, Nortel was alleging that those employees had been targeted because of their knowledge of trade secrets. The last time Canada experienced a brain drain like this was right after the Avro Arrow, when the project was shut down in 1959, rather than converting the plant to civilian.
There was leaked emails, I think, from
Okay. Brother. What? Masih muda. Atrás. Sim. Coisa. 이거 좋아요.
From Apple, there's a great. I love to read corporate emails that get public, like the Sony ones, the Apple ones. I like to see how CEOs talk to other CEOs. It's very interesting. It's very fascinating. And there's a classic Steve Jobs email where He gets 2 Apple engineers poached by Adobe, and he emails the Adobe CEO. By the way, this is collusion and is illegal. And he basically threatens, like, hey, if you're going to poach any of our guys, we're going to poach all of yours. I thought we had an agreement, hint, hint. He doesn't say it like that, but it basically says, like, hey, if you try to... And, you know, what that is a conspiracy between 2 employers to keep wages down. Because if they could both poach each other's people, then they would have better opportunities and make more money. But, yeah, he says one of our policies is going to have to change. Let me know who. This is it. Yeah, this is Bruce. Adobe is recruiting from Apple. They have hired 1 person already and are calling lots more. I have a standing policy with our recruiters that we don't recruit from Adobe. It seems you have a different policy. One of us must change our policy. Please let me know who. It's tough, but it is 100% illegal collusion. Okay.
Billion aircraft, 14,000.
What makes illegal collusion? Adobe and Apple agreeing to not give offers to each other's employees is a way of keeping the market for those employees down, making their wages lower. They should not be able to collude at all as competitors. They should 100% be out in an open market for employee talent that makes the wages rise up to whatever their demand is. The reason they do this, the reason Apple will be mad about this, is because it causes their salaries to go up. Is that really illegal if they had agreement not to do it? Yes, it is illegal. 100%. The employees can sue. It's against labor laws. You cannot have a monopoly. Actually, it's happened. This has happened. They've been sued. I think Microsoft, Apple, and another big tech company got sued for this, for colluding to keep wages down.
Of Canada's best engineers were unceremoniously laid off. Guess who benefited from that? Those Canadians immigrated down south and went on to play a not-so-minor role in the founding of a little organization called NASA. John Roth was arguing that this saga was repeating. In his eyes, it was no wonder that highly educated
Canadians founded NASA?
They got higher salaries, better stock options, and their taxes were lower. Highly paid tech workers would be unlikely to require things like public housing, and job offers from Silicon Valley companies often came with cushy private health insurance. If Canada wanted to keep those PhDs north of the border, then they obviously had to cut taxes. That was his argument, at least, but the validity of it is hard to evaluate. One study between 1997 and 2002 found that on average, 23,000 university-educated workers left Canada each year for the US job market. And in 1998, Statistics Canada confirmed that yes, a brain drain was occurring. However, it was small, much smaller than the one during the 50s and 60s, and more than offset by a brain gain from people immigrating to Canada, by a factor of 4. And on top of that, a later study from 2013 found that this brain drain was often temporary.
Yeah, the only thing that mass cutting taxes will do is make your society a hellhole that people don't want to live in or come back to. It'll exacerbate the income inequality. It'll increase homelessness, you know what I'm saying? Reduce social services, make it more punishing to reach poverty. It's a very, very short-term mindset. If you make the best place to live, people will come there. People will immigrate in.
Around 50% of graduates who moved to the US later moving back to Canada. There are clearly some additional, harder to quantify variables at play here. But here's the thing. This is about a narrative, and John Roth had a narrative that the media loved.
Twitter just published an update and exploded? Wait, what do you mean? Wow. That's working. It took a while to load. It's taking a really long time to load, but it's working. Didn't explode. Don't lie, bro. You're fucking with my vibe.
Nortel had ballooned so spectacularly that it was worth more than the rest of its own parent company, BCE. His quotes were being published every other week in newspapers.
Wait, it's actually broken? I mean, I just loaded it. Let's check. Is Twitter down? We'll go to down detector. Oh, something's happening for sure. Yeah, for sure. For sure something's... Hey, where's the fucking Garm guy who's telling me how Elon was big winning? Where's that guy at? Where was the fucking guy at the start of stream? She's proper fucked. Wait, maybe it's an app problem. Let's see. What are we gonna do with the other everything app? Dude, why wouldn't I want to spend $100 million on ads here? Yeah, my app's not working. Interesting.
He was on TV talking about the brain drain. John Roth.
If Elon sabotages X, can he somehow get out of his debt? No, dude. What kind of cartoon world do you... How would that work? The company's been his for a long time now, years. What? There's no... Yeah, I mean, yes, they can declare bankruptcy 100%, then give it back to and the banks will own it. Yeah, they can do that. But Elon can't hijinks his way out of the debt.
He was not simply a Canadian CEO, he was the Canadian CEO. His rhetoric was being echoed by the leaders of the two conservative parties, who began to demand for further tax cuts. The culmination of this was a widely publicized feud with Finance Minister Paul Martin. The role of Finance Minister is generally one of the most sought-after cabinet positions, and Paul Martin was particularly influential. After coming in second behind Chrétien in the party leadership race, Martin had been biding his time ever since, stoking internal divisions within the party, and would successfully force out his boss in 2003. What this means is that John Roth was sparring with a future prime minister. Quote, Canadian taxes are too high. They are driving out top talent, the Gretzkys of high tech. And Martin would hit back.
So Canadian pilled. To bring Wayne Gretzky into every conversation.
Do I believe that some people leave Canada and that these are the kind of people we should not lose? Yes. Do I believe that they leave because of taxes? No. As much as the government tried to argue against it, politics is about optics. In February 2000, Paul Martin introduced what amounted to $58 billion in tax cuts and a significant overhaul to the tax bracket system. With an election becoming increasingly likely as the year dragged on, Paul Martin delivered a killing blow to the conservative platforms by unveiling a second mini-budget in October, which added even more cuts and sped up many of the changes promised in February. By one-upping the opposition on taxes and with healthcare as a further wedge issue, the Liberals cruised to another huge majority in November of that year. John Roth had gone toe-to-toe with the future Prime Minister, and he had won. For this saga, Time Canada named him Canadian Newsmaker of the Year. Although most Canadians were focused on changes to the middle tax bracket, for the John Roths out there, the real headline was the corporate tax rate, which would be dropped from 28% to just 21% over the next 5 years.
That's good for
Employee
inequality.
stock options also got a revamp. They now had a built-in tax deferral clause, meaning you wouldn't owe taxes until you sold your shares. And of course, the capital gains tax, which as we saw last time contributed significantly to the Canadian stock praise. It started the year at 75%, but was down to 66% in February. This would have been the end of it, but then the Tory government in Ontario said, hey, we're going to lower ours to 50%. Not wanting to be outflanked on taxes in an election year, Paul Martin said, fine, we'll do it first. And so by October, he had slashed it again and brought it down to 50%, which is where it stands to this day.
Okay.
In a global financial market that was so often dominated by American companies, John Roth had done everything he could to level the playing field. But still, Nortel lacked one key trick that Lucent and Cisco had access to, and John Roth had a plan for that as well.
Analog and DFT, how much better can it be? Anesthetic on the floor, I can take it anymore.
I don't think I want to pay this anymore.
To understand the root of Nortel's problems, you have to go back to a PR incident in late 1998. See this plunge in price? It was caused by 12 words. The recent Bay Networks purchase was not an immediate slam dunk. The company had not been without its own issues. It had been formed from the merger of two other tech companies who had overlapping product lines, and some of its senior employees had jumped ship. At $9.1 billion, many observers thought that Nortel had way overpaid. And by fall 1998, it wasn't clear if Bay was helping Nortel's cash flow. Nortel had just released some earnings numbers that didn't factor in the Bay purchase, even though the two companies had already merged. At their annual investor meeting in late September, Nortel's then CFO, Wes Scott, got up on stage to try and clear up the confusion. Referring to their projected annual growth of 14%, he said something to the effect of, in the high teens with Bay included, and low teens without Bay. Technically, this was not new information, and yet he hadn't even finished his sentence and a room of 500 people had entirely vacated. All the analysts had left to tell anyone who would listen to cash out of Nortel and to do it fast. In the days that followed, Nortel lost 20% or $9 billion Canadian in
Buy the
value.
dip!
Since announcing the Bay purchase, they were down by 50%. One audience member remarked, it was only 12 words. That works out to $750 million per word. It was a hard lesson for Nortel. This stock price crater had undone basically all the gains that had been made under John Roth's tenure as CEO.
I remember at NVIDIA, when crypto first crashed. This is before AI was really talked about. And it was just a GPU company. It was like maybe my first year there, maybe a second. And all the GPUs were sold out because of crypto. And so everything was selling like fucking gangbusters, and all the earnings reports were good. And the stock, so it's been split so many times, the number doesn't matter, but it was like 300, you know? And then the crypto bubble burst the first time before it came back. And there started to be a ton of GPUs piling up as like used in secondhand. And the next earning wasn't so good. And the stock dropped 50% like that, like fucking insta. And I remember walking around the office and everyone was fucking moping, talking about I should have sold. I should have sold at 300. Good thing you fucking didn't, bro. Good thing you fucking didn't if you held on. But I 100% remember that vibe. I remember Shroomed actually. If you guys know Shroomed, he's a Melee player who does he works at NVIDIA. He did testing for NVIDIA. I think he still does. And he was just fucking despondent. He's like, I was about to sell. I was this. Yeah, Dewan. Good that you didn't, bro.
He was approaching his threshold. The lesson here was that frank honesty is bad for the stock price. You gotta give investors only what they want to hear. Wes Scott was booted from the CFO role early the next year. He would be replaced by Frank Dunn, a longtime ally of John Roth. From this incident onwards, Nortel would concoct a new type of financial reporting: earnings from operations. I already know that for most of you watching this, your eyes just glossed over. I get it. It sounds like an Econ 101 term, something straight out of an accounting textbook. But it's deceptive. These three specific words, in this specific order, is not something you can find in a textbook. It's an invention entirely unique to Nortel.
It's not unique to Nortel. All these fucking shit companies do this. They do adjusted EBITDA. They do innovation-focused EBITDA. They do all sorts of fucking financial terms that basically say, here's a way to show all the money we're making without all the costs associated with it. Because those don't count. Those don't fucking count. There's a million different terms that they've all used. They've always found fancy ways to say it. It's always just a way to say we're making money and ignore our costs, because often their costs are greater than what they made. Often it's a bad business. It doesn't work. But they don't want to count that. You know, it'll be like let's say you start a fucking pizza delivery robot company or whatever, and you do sell, I don't know, $500,000 worth of pizzas. You would be like, wow, look at this growth number. We sold 200,000 last year, 500,000 this year. But what you take out of your report is that you spent, you know, $1 million and then $2 million on marketing just to get that much, you know, because people don't want to fucking do it. So you have to like fucking, you have to do these promotions and deals, and yeah, that's what it is like. It's all ways of trying to show growth while ignoring the fact that your costs are rising at a higher level. The only thing that really, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can look at, but the best thing, the most pure thing to look at is free cash flow. Free cash flow. What actual cash is coming in left over after everything? If you can look at free cash flow and that's growing, almost always the company's doing good. Almost always. Free cash flow is what you want to look at.
A smokescreen that hit just how bad things were from investors. So there's this thing in the US called GAAP,
oh, he's gonna explain it.
Right? Generally accepted accounting principles. Essentially, a big group of accountants, the FASB, come together and make a set of standardized rules for reporting a company's finances. It makes it so you can compare different companies on a level playing field and helps investors make informed decisions. It's not technically a law, but if you're a publicly traded company, the SEC can issue fines if you don't follow GAAP, and even private companies tend to follow it so they can get loans from banks. Now, Canada at this time had its own version of GAAP.
Crap.
Nortel, which was owned by a Canadian parent company at the time, was required to follow Canadian GAAP, which was frustrating for Nortel because it meant they couldn't take advantage of the highly controversial Opinion 16, aka the pooling rule. When you buy a company, you're paying for two types of assets, tangibles and intangibles. Tangible assets would be physical stuff, like offices, factories, equipment, employees, stuff that has a clear dollar value. The intangibles, though, are harder to quantify. This might be brand recognition, customer relationships, or in this new exciting .com era, the future potential of R&D. If I buy a company for $10 million, but they only have $3 million in tangible assets, that means I paid a premium of $7 million. This premium is called goodwill, and goodwill has to be recognized on your balance sheet, subtracting from your revenues as a rapidly depreciating asset. Here's where the controversy comes in. Way back in 1970, the FSAB had drafted Opinion 16, a rule that dictated how companies report expenses after a merger. When two companies of equal size merge together, say Exxon and Mobil, they take all their shares and combine them into one big pool. The assets have been combined, no money has traded hands, and so it doesn't count as goodwill. However, by the 90s, corporations realized that the pooling rule could be abused. It didn't just work for a merger of two equals. It could be applied to one company buying another. A big company prints new shares and swaps them with the employees of the small one. There is no pooling taking place here. Shares have traded hands. But because those employees were now part of the big company, the pooling rule technically applied. As long as you paid with shares instead of cash, the pooling rule effectively made the acquisition free. It was like goodwill never existed. Now, the FSAB wasn't dumb. They realized what was happening and wanted to scrap pooling as early as 1996. The problem was that they faced intense lobbying efforts.
I wonder, I thought cash was part of it, but I don't remember. Was the Amazon acquisition of Twitch all stock? I do know that all of our Twitch shares got swapped for Amazon shares. 1-to-1, by the way. That was the come up with a cinch. But I don't remember if there was cash involved. Twitch acquisition, Amazon cash or stock. It was all cash. I guess they just changed your equity as an employee. Yeah, it was all cash. The owners got all cash, and then all the employees got switched. Okay, interesting.
From tech companies who sunk millions into the pockets of Republicans and Democrats, particularly in California. The tech sector sunk around $40 billion in political contributions in just the year 2000. Despite this, the FASB continued to fight back and eventually managed to get the pooling rule scrapped, a change that would take effect on January 1st of 2002. Of the big three telecom companies, only Cisco could make use of pooling, and it took advantage every chance it got. Nortel couldn't because it was stuck following Canadian GAAP, and Lucent couldn't until late 1998. This was a condition of its spin-off from AT&T, that it couldn't use pooling for the first 3 years. You can see how this would be endlessly frustrating for Nortel and Lucent. Just 3 months after their ban on pooling expired, Lucent made its first major purchase in January 1999 with Ascend Communications. Now it was just Nortel without a free money glitch. So what did Nortel do? They did it anyway. The thing is, there is nothing preventing a company from publishing their GAAP numbers and then also publishing a different set of numbers that make their company look better. So long as you clearly define which ones are GAAP and which ones aren't, there is nothing illegal about that. You could bury them in the fine print, or you could publish your annual report on a big news day so no one pays attention. This type of creative accounting fueled the entire dot-com bubble. You had startups worth billions of dollars on the stock market and yet had no products and no revenues. They were just offices with a few computers, a website, maybe a foosball table. The 1990s were the wild west of investing, and it became almost impossible for financial analysts, much less the average person, to decipher the dozens of different GAAP versus non-GAAP numbers. It was like apples.
Never trust
oranges
non-GAAP numbers
prime
ever.
rib steaks. To be clear, what Nortel was about to do was not unique, and it was not illegal. Nortel was just doing it at an unimaginable scale. And so, under the new CFO Frank Dunn, Nortel released their annual report for 1998. In it, the cost of the Bay Network's buyout was simply not factored in the headline numbers. Buried at the bottom were the GAAP numbers. What would have been a $569 million loss under GAAP was a $1 billion profit under Nortel's nonsense numbers. Here's another headline. Revenues up 22%, up to $4.4 billion. But buried at the end of the paragraph is the GAAP number. The quarter actually saw a loss of $470 million. As Nortel continued to buy around one new company a month, their financial situation continued to worsen. Paying a premium in shares costs way more than paying with cash. Shares are inherently more risky. Their value can go up and down at the drop of a hat. A company about to be bought out is going to demand a big premium. Qterra, for instance, had been valued at around $68 million the year prior, only to be bought by Nortel for $3 billion. I have a hard time believing they went up in value 40 times
fucking
in just
overpay.
1 year. Of the nearly $22 billion spent on goodwill, only $450 million of it was paid using cash. One estimate by analyst Al Rosen says that if they had paid with cash, Nortel could have saved $13.4 billion. Were these acquired companies even profitable? Were they bringing in new revenue? Nortel made it impossible to tell. They weren't kept as distinct subsidiaries. They were absorbed into the existing corporate structure. Their revenues all mixed together in an opaque sludge. And the acquisitions were hardly efficient. Many product lines overlapped. Nortel now had 2, maybe 3 divisions working on competing products. Of course, all of this doesn't matter so long as the stock price.
So true!
As we saw earlier, Nortel's already distorted presence on the Toronto Stock Exchange allowed it to exploit these buyouts to further inflate its share price. As long as the stock stayed steady and the orders from customers kept coming in, they would never feel the cost of those acquisitions. And here's the kicker. Executive bonuses weren't paid according to GAAP numbers. They were paid according to Nortel's custom accounting. By selling his shares in August 2000, John Roth cashed out for $36 million.
Interesting. What a good time to cash out. I wonder if he had any knowledge of the underlying unhealth of the business when he did that.
Go by his yearly salary, it would have taken him 30 years to earn what he had just made in 1 day of trading. In the 4 years he was CEO of Nortel, he raked in around $130 million. And during his 4 years as Nortel's CEO, Nortel hadn't posted a single profit.
It's just defrauding massive amounts.
I gather the results might have
This
been.
guy's actually based. All he did was defraud all of Canada. He defrauded every average Canadian citizen out of a little bit of their money so he could get rich and his friends could get rich. Oh, baby. Oh, baby.
better if you've been able to fulfill more orders. How are you going to deal with those bottlenecks?
Well, we've been working that very aggressively, as you might imagine. This is one of the problems you'd like to have from time to time, but we don't want it to last too long.
Success a nightmare? It may seem that way if you don't have the right tools to handle it.
The dot-com bubble had burst on March 28, 2000. All those internet startups had finally burned through their venture capital money. The tech-heavy NASDAQ index begins to plummet. That year, 14 dot-com companies ran Super Bowl ads for around $2 million each. And later that year, 2/3 of those same companies went bankrupt. The business models never took off, and only the most hardened players, the Amazons, the eBays, managed to stick around. Logically, you would think that when the...
If you ever want to read a good business piece of writing, go read Jeff Bezos' shareholder letter to Amazon shareholders in 2001. It starts off with just one word, ouch. They lost 90% of their value in like 3 weeks. It's it's really good. It's very strong. It's like a very refocusing on the core. I don't know. It's good. It's good business writing.
When the dot-com bubble burst, the telecom bubble would immediately follow. But that's not quite what happened. Just because a bunch of California yuppies in their parents' garages couldn't put together a business plan doesn't mean the sky is falling. The Nortels, the Ciscos, the Lucents were planning for the future here. Just like the race to build the early cross-continental railroads, this was a race to install the world's fiber optic networks. If you build it, they will come. People were still going to need the internet. The three-way race continued well into the summer. By July, there were rumors of yet another massive buyout. Nortel was in talks to acquire Corning. Corning is the company when it comes to glass. They were the ones who made the glass for Thomas Edison's
Why would
light.
Nortel buy
These
Corning?
days, they were known for mass-producing the thin strands of glass used to transmit binary laser pulses, fiber optic cables. The magnitude of this deal cannot be
$100 billion.
It wasn't meant to be, however. Rumors of the deal caused Nortel's stock price to rocket up even higher, causing Corning's investors to panic, and the deal was abandoned. This is the absolute peak that Nortel will reach, $124.50. They will never get back above this line. Go ahead and take in the view, because it will only last a few weeks. Nortel had spent the past year as the darling of the Canadian stock market, but if you go looking...
Love the guys right here, who fucking saw the buying opportunity. Everyone right here said, wait, whoa, discount, cha-ching! I am the smart investor. When there's blood in the streets, I buy. I am genius. I am very smart.
Nortel had spent the past year as the darling of the Canadian stock market, but if you go looking for them, you can find a handful of Nortel skeptics who predicted the inevitable fall with stunning accuracy. Al Rosen had been one of the first to raise the alarm bell on the earnings from operations nonsense, and he advised his clients to stay well away from Nortel. Ross Healy was notable for going on live TV and predicting a